Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The Town That Time Forgot. From Marcus Holloway. The CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of 3 hours when I first noticed the road signs weren't matching my GPS anymore. My Peterbilt's diesel engine hummed its familiar rhythm beneath me, a comforting vibration that had carried me through countless nights like this one. The rain had started around midnight, creating a steady percussion against the windshield that should have been soothing, but something about this particular stretch of Interstate 84 through eastern Oregon felt different. Wrong, somehow. I'd been driving long haul for 15 years, and I knew this route like the back of my weathered hands. Portland to Denver, a run I'd made dozens of times hauling electronics and machinery for various companies. The familiar landmarks should have been appearing right on schedule. The truck stop at mile marker 247, the broken down barn with the faded mail pouch tobacco advertisement, the bridge over Willow Creek where the road curved slightly north. But as my headlights cut through the darkness and rain, none of these markers appeared when they should have. Instead, the highway stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by dense stands of pine and fir that seemed to press closer to the asphalt than I remembered. The yellow center lines blurred past in a hypnotic rhythm, and the only sounds were the rain, the engine, and the occasional squeal of my windshield wipers fighting against the downpour. My CB had gone completely silent now, not even picking up the usual chatter from other drivers or the distant murmur of AM radio stations bleeding through. That's when I saw the green highway sign emerging from the darkness ahead, its reflective surface catching my headlights like a beacon. I slowed the rig slightly, expecting to see the familiar Pendleton 47 miles or LeGrand 89 miles that marked this section of the interstate. But as the sign grew larger in my windshield, the white lettering spelled out something I'd never seen before. Millbrook 12 miles, next right. I frowned, trying to place the name. Millbrook. In all my years running this route, I'd never heard of any town called Millbrook. My GPS showed nothing but empty forest for miles in every direction, and the official DOT atlas tucked behind my seat made no mention of such a place. Yet, there it was, an official-looking highway sign complete with a standard green background and reflective white lettering that marked legitimate exits throughout the interstate system. The rain was getting heavier now, reducing visibility to maybe 50 yards ahead of my headlights. My fuel gauge showed just over a quarter tank. Not dangerously low, but getting close to the point where I'd normally start looking for a truck stop. The next scheduled fuel stop, according to my route plan, was still 90 miles ahead in LeGrand, but if this Millbrook was a real town, it might have a gas station, or at least somewhere I could pull over and wait out the storm. 12 miles later, exactly as the sign had promised, another green marker appeared in my headlights. Millbrook, exit 237. Below it, a smaller sign proclaimed, gas, food, lodging. The exit ramp curved away to the right, disappearing into the darkness between towering evergreens. I'd driven past hundreds of similar exits over the years, but something about this one made me hesitate. The asphalt looked newer than the main highway, almost freshly paved, yet there were no construction signs or orange barrels that typically marked recent road work. I guided the Peterbilt onto the off-ramp, my Jake brake engaging with its characteristic rumbling growl as we descended into the forest. The rain seemed even heavier here, drumming against the cab roof like thousands of tiny fingers, tapping out an urgent message. The ramp curved through the trees for what felt like miles, far longer than most interstate exits, before finally straightening into a 2-lane road that led toward a soft glow filtering through the darkness ahead. As I crested a small hill, the town of Millbrook spread out before me like something from a postcard. Street lamps lined perfectly straight avenues, casting pools of warm yellow light that reflected off the wet pavement. Two-story buildings with neat facades flanked what appeared to be a main street, their windows glowing softly with what looked like lamplight rather than the harsh fluorescence I'd grown accustomed to in most small towns. A church spire rose from the center of town, and I could make out the shapes of houses with white picket fences extending into the residential areas beyond. The strangest part wasn't what I saw, but what I didn't hear. As my rig rolled down the main street at idle speed, there was no sound except my own engine and the rain. No traffic noise, no music from bars or restaurants, no voices or footsteps or doors closing. The town appeared to be inhabited. Lights were on in most of the buildings, and I could see the occasional silhouette moving behind curtained windows, but it was as silent as a photograph. I spotted a gas station about halfway down the main street, an old-fashioned place with rounded pumps and a sign that simply read "Fuel" in red neon letters. The price display was dark, but the pumps looked operational, and there was plenty of room for my rig in the wide lot out front. I pulled in slowly, the air brakes hissing as I came to a stop beside the diesel pump. The silence outside was even more pronounced once I shut off the engine. No wind in the trees, no distant highway noise, no crickets or nightbirds, just the tick of cooling metal and the steady patter of rain on my cab roof. I climbed down from the driver's seat, pulling my jacket tight against the wetness, and approached the pump. The fuel dispenser was unlike any I'd seen before, built in a style that reminded me of the 1950S, but clearly functional and well-maintained. There was no credit card reader, no digital display showing fuel grades and prices, just a simple mechanical counter and a handwritten sign taped to the side that read "Pay Inside." I tried the nozzle anyway, but nothing happened when I squeezed the handle. The station's office sat about 20 feet away, a small building with large windows and a door marked with a bell that should have chimed when I entered. But like everything else in Millbrook, it was silent as I stepped inside. The interior looked like something preserved from decades past. A manual cash register, shelves stocked with glass bottles of soda I hadn't seen since childhood, candy bars and wrappers I didn't recognize, and a rack of road maps that showed highways and towns from what appeared to be the 1960. Behind the counter stood a man in his 50s, wearing a clean white shirt and a smile that never wavered. His hair was perfectly styled, slicked back with what might have been Brill cream, and his eyes had a peculiar quality. They seemed to focus on me but also somehow through me, as if I were only partially there. "Evening, driver," he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone from an earlier era. "Quite a storm we're having tonight. You'll be needing fuel for that fine rig of yours, I expect." "Yes, sir," I replied, though something about his manner made me uneasy. "Diesel, if you've got it. Fill her up, please." Of course. We've got all the diesel a traveler could need." He moved toward the door with smooth, gliding steps. "You just wait right here and I'll get you taken care of." While he was outside, presumably starting the pump, I examined the maps on the rack more closely. They were official Highway Department publications, but the dates were all from the 1960s and early 1970s. More troubling, the Interstate 84 shown on these maps didn't match the route I'd been driving. The highway system depicted here showed different exits, different towns, and most disturbing of all, Millbrook appeared on every single map, marked with a prominent star as if it were a major destination. The bell above the door should have announced the attendant's return, but he simply appeared beside me with that same unchanging smile. "All set, driver. She's taking fuel nicely. Should be topped off in just a few minutes." "These maps," I said, pointing to the rack, "they're pretty old, aren't they?" His smile never faltered, but something shifted in his eyes. "Time moves differently here in Millbrook," he said. "We find that the old ways work best. No need to change what's already perfect." Through the window I could see other people now, walking slowly along the sidewalks despite the rain. Men in suits and hats, women in dresses that fell below the knee, children in clothing that looked like it came from a different decade entirely. None of them seemed bothered by the weather, and all of them moved with the same gliding gait as the station attendant. "How many people live here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Oh, just the right number," he replied. "Everyone who belongs here finds their way to us eventually, and everyone who's meant to leave." He paused, that smile growing slightly wider. "Well, they usually find their way out again." The way he emphasized "usually" sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the rain-soaked night. I glanced toward my truck, where the fuel nozzle was still in the tank. The mechanical counter on the pump had been spinning continuously, but it should have stopped by now. My tank couldn't possibly hold that much diesel. "It looks like it's still pumping," I said, moving toward the door. "Patience, driver. These old pumps work at their own pace. No sense rushing good service." But I was already outside, walking quickly through the rain toward my rig. The counter on the pump showed an impossible number. Over 300 gallons, far more than my tank could hold. Yet when I looked underneath the truck, there was no fuel spilling onto the ground. The diesel was going somewhere, but not into my tank. I grabbed the nozzle and pulled it free, listening for the sound of fuel sloshing in the tank. Nothing. My gauge still showed the same quarter tank I'd arrived with. I'd been watching the pump for nearly 10 minutes, seen the counter spinning continuously, but somehow no fuel had actually entered my truck. The attendant appeared beside me again, materializing from the rain-soaked darkness with that perpetual smile. "Having trouble with the pump, driver?" "It's not working," I said, backing toward my cab. "The fuel's not going in." "Oh, but it is," he said, his voice taking on a sing-song quality. "Everything here works exactly as it should. The fuel goes where it needs to go, just like travelers go where they need to go." Around us, more people had appeared, all walking slowly through the rain, all wearing that same unchanging smile. They formed a loose circle around my truck, not threatening exactly, but definitely preventing any quick escape. Men in business suits from the Eisenhower era, women with perfectly styled hair that the rain never touched, children with rosy cheeks and old-fashioned clothing, all moving with that same unnaturally smooth gait. "I need to get back on the road," I said, climbing up toward my driver's seat. "My company's expecting this load in Denver." "But you just arrived," the attendant called up to me. "Millbrook has so much to offer a weary traveler. Clean sheets, hot meals, friendly faces. Why don't you stay the night? See what our little town is all about." I was already turning the key, praying the old Peterbilt would start on the first try. The diesel engine cranked once, twice, then roared to life with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the supernatural quiet of Millbrook. The people surrounding my truck didn't move, but their smiles grew wider, stretching their faces in ways that shouldn't have been possible. "You'll be back," the attendant said, his voice somehow carrying clearly over the engine noise. "They always come back. Millbrook has a way of calling to travelers who've seen our hospitality." I put the truck in gear and began rolling forward slowly, careful not to hit any of the people who still hadn't moved from their positions around my rig. They watched me pass with those impossibly wide smiles, their heads turning to track my movement, but their feet remaining planted on the wet asphalt. In my side mirrors, I could see them still standing there long after I should have been out of their sight. The road out of Millbrook seemed longer than the road in, winding through the forest for miles, before finally reconnecting with what I hoped was Interstate 84. When I finally saw the familiar green sign marking the on-ramp, I nearly wept with relief. My GPS flickered back to life as I merged onto the highway, showing my location exactly where it should be according to my original route plan. But as I accelerated back up to highway speed, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My fuel gauge, which had showed a quarter tank when I stopped in Millbrook, now read completely full. The diesel I hadn't received was somehow in my tank after all, along with something else. A faint smell in the cab that reminded me of old leather and hair tonic, scents from a different era that had somehow followed me out of that impossible town. I drove straight through to Denver without stopping, afraid that if I pulled over anywhere else, I might find myself back on that exit ramp, back in Millbrook where time moved differently and travelers sometimes found more than they bargained for. But even now, weeks later, I sometimes catch that scent in my cab on rainy nights, and I find myself looking for green highway signs that promise towns not marked on any map. They say the road calls to some drivers, that there are places out there where the asphalt leads to destinations that exist between the lines of official atlases. I used to think that was just trucker folklore, stories shared over CB radios and truck stop coffee, but now I know better. Now I know that somewhere out there, in the rain-soaked darkness between mile markers, Millbrook is waiting for the next traveler who needs fuel and finds more than they expected. The attendant was right about one thing. I think about going back sometimes, usually on nights like the one when I first found that exit ramp. Part of me wonders what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd accepted that offer of clean sheets and hot meals and friendly faces. But then I remember those impossible smiles, the way they stretched too wide, and the sound of that fuel pump running forever without ever filling my tank. Some roads are meant to be traveled only once, and some towns are meant to remain exactly where you left them, preserved in the rain and darkness between what is and what might be. Millbrook is still out there, I'm sure of it, waiting for the next driver who strays from the familiar routes and finds themselves in need of fuel in the middle of a storm. I just hope they have better sense than to stop. The Eyes That Shine in Darkness, from Rebecca Torres. I should have known something was wrong when I caught my own reflection in the truck stop bathroom mirror that Tuesday evening in Bakersfield. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead with their usual harsh buzz, casting everything in that unflattering greenish glow that made everyone look half dead. But when I glanced up from washing my hands, my eyes seemed to catch the light differently than they should have. For just a moment they gleamed back at me like polished coins, reflecting the overhead bulbs with an intensity that made me blink and look again. The second glance showed nothing unusual, just my tired brown eyes staring back from a face that had seen too many long hauls and not enough sleep. I chalked it up to exhaustion and the strange way those particular lights played tricks on everyone who spent time under them. After all, I'd been running hard for 3 days straight, hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Phoenix to Sacramento, and my Kenworth T680 had been eating up the miles with the steady rhythm that comes from a well-tuned engine and a driver who knows her business. The Central Valley stretched ahead of me as I pulled back onto Highway 99, endless flat farmland disappearing into the darkness beyond my headlights. The air conditioning hummed quietly, fighting against the late summer heat that lingered even after sunset, and my CB radio murmured with the distant conversations of other drivers scattered across the night highways. It was the kind of peaceful solitude that had drawn me to long-haul trucking in the first place, the meditative quality of rolling through the darkness with nothing but the road ahead and the steady pulse of diesel engines carrying commerce across the sleeping continent. But as the miles passed beneath my wheels, I began to notice things that shouldn't have been there. Small details at first, barely worth mentioning. My depth perception seemed sharper than usual, allowing me to spot road debris and wildlife at distances that should have been impossible in the darkness. When a family of deer crossed the highway nearly a quarter mile ahead, I could make out individual animals with a clarity that surprised me, even though my headlights couldn't possibly have illuminated them at that range. Then there were the sounds. My hearing had always been good, a useful trait for a driver who needed to listen for changes in engine tone or the telltale whistle of air leaks in the brake system. But tonight, I could hear conversations from other trucks on the highway, words carried on the wind through open windows, discussions about fuel stops and delivery schedules that should have been lost in the roar of engines and road noise. At first I assumed my CB was picking up transmissions, but when I checked, the radio was tuned to a clear channel with no activity. The strangest part was how comfortable I felt driving in the darkness. Normally, I'd have my high beams on whenever possible, sweeping the road ahead for hazards and obstacles. But tonight, the ambient starlight seemed sufficient, as if my eyes were gathering and amplifying every photon that fell from the clear desert sky. The dashboard instruments glowed with their familiar blue and orange lights, but I found myself looking at them less and less, trusting instead to senses that seemed heightened beyond their normal capabilities. Around midnight, I pulled into a truck stop outside of Modesto, a sprawling complex of fuel islands and parking spaces that catered to the endless stream of commercial traffic flowing through the Central Valley. The place was busy even at this late hour, with drivers grabbing showers, meals, and mandatory rest breaks before continuing their journeys. I parked at the far end of the lot, away from the main building's neon glow, and shut down my engine for a quick walk and stretch before tackling the final 100 miles to Sacramento. As I climbed down from the cab, another driver was walking past, a weathered man in his 60s wearing the kind of worn jeans and flannel shirt that marked him as old-school trucker. He glanced my way with the casual acknowledgement that drivers usually share, but then he stopped abruptly, his expression changing from mild interest to something approaching alarm. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a slight tremor, "you might want to get those eyes checked when you get a chance." I turned to face him fully, puzzled by his reaction. "What do you mean?" He took a step backward, his hand moving unconsciously to the cell phone clipped to his belt. "They're reflecting the light," he said quietly, "like a cat's eyes, or maybe a deer's. Bright green, like headlights hitting a road sign." I raised my hand to touch my face, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm sorry. I don't understand. Look, I've been driving for 40 years, he continued, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. I've seen plenty of strange things out on the highways, things that don't make it into the official reports. But I've never seen a person's eyes do what yours are doing right now. You might want to find a mirror, take a look for yourself." He hurried away toward the main building, glancing back over his shoulder once before disappearing into the harsh fluorescent glow of the truck stop. I stood alone beside my rig, feeling suddenly isolated despite the dozens of other vehicles parked around me. The ambient noise of idling engines and distant conversations seemed muted, as if I were hearing them from underwater or through thick glass. I found a side mirror on a nearby trailer and angled it to catch the reflection of my face in the parking lot lighting. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. My eyes were indeed reflecting light with an unnatural intensity, glowing with a soft green radiance that pulsed gently in rhythm with my heartbeat. The effect was subtle but unmistakable, like the eyeshine of nocturnal animals caught in a flashlight beam. My first instinct was to panic, to drive immediately to the nearest hospital emergency room and demand answers from medical professionals who might understand what was happening to me. But as I stood there studying my reflection, I realized that despite the disturbing visual change, I felt better than I had in years. My chronic back pain from long hours behind the wheel had disappeared completely. The constant fatigue that came with irregular sleep schedules and truck stop food had been replaced by an energy that seemed to flow through every cell in my body. Even my vision, which had been slowly declining with age, was now sharper than it had been in decades. I climbed back into my cab and sat in the driver's seat, trying to process what was happening to me. The logical part of my mind insisted that I needed medical attention, that glowing eyes were a symptom of some serious condition that required immediate treatment. But another part of me, a part that seemed to be growing stronger by the hour, whispered that this change was not a disease but an evolution, an enhancement that would make me a better driver, more capable of handling the challenges of life on the road. As I sat there in the darkness of my cab, I became aware of sounds and scents that had been invisible to me before. I could hear the conversations of drivers 50 yards away, discussing routes and schedules with perfect clarity. The smell of cooling asphalt mixed with diesel exhaust created a complex bouquet that told me stories about the trucks around me, their mechanical condition, the loads they carried, even the emotional states of their drivers. When I finally started my engine and pulled back onto the highway, The night seemed transformed around me. Every detail of the landscape was visible in sharp relief, from the individual leaves on roadside trees to the small animals moving through the grass beside the shoulder. Other vehicles appeared as bright beacons in my enhanced vision, their headlights and taillights creating trails of light that lingered in my perception long after they passed. But it was the other drivers that commanded most of my attention. As trucks passed me going in the opposite direction, I found myself making eye contact with their operators through the windshields, brief moments of connection that shouldn't have been possible at highway speeds in the darkness. And in those fleeting glimpses, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Some of the other drivers had eyes like mine. Not all of them, perhaps not even most of them, but enough to establish a pattern. Men and women of various ages, all with that same soft green glow emanating from their eyes, all driving with the same fluid confidence that I now felt behind the wheel. They would nod slightly as we passed, acknowledging what we shared with subtle gestures that spoke of membership in some exclusive club whose rules I was only beginning to understand. The realization that I wasn't alone in this transformation should have been comforting, but instead it filled me with a growing sense of unease. How long had this been happening? How many drivers on America's highways were carrying this change within them, their eyes reflecting light like nocturnal predators? And more importantly, what did it mean for those of us who had been chosen, or infected, or whatever term applied to our condition? As I approached the outskirts of Sacramento, preparing to deliver my load and find a place to rest, I caught sight of my reflection in the passenger side mirror. My eyes were glowing more brightly now, the green light pulsing with increased intensity. But there was something else in that reflection, something that made me grip the steering wheel tighter and press my foot harder on the accelerator. For just a moment, superimposed over my own face, I saw the features of something that wasn't entirely human. The bone structure was wrong, too angular, with teeth that were slightly too sharp, and skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The vision lasted only seconds, but it was enough to confirm what I'd been trying to deny since leaving the truck stop. Whatever was happening to me, whatever I was becoming, it was changing more than just my vision. The enhanced senses, the increased energy, the ability to see clearly in complete darkness. These weren't medical symptoms, but evolutionary adaptations, modifications that were preparing me for something that I couldn't yet comprehend. I delivered my load without incident, though I noticed that the warehouse workers seemed nervous around me, avoiding direct eye contact and completing the paperwork with unusual haste. As I drove away from the loading dock, I caught one of them on his radio, speaking in urgent whispers about another one of those drivers with the strange eyes, and recommending that management contact someone about the situation. Now I'm parked at a rest area north of Sacramento, watching the sun rise over the Sierra Nevada mountains and feeling my enhanced vision fade with the growing daylight. My eyes appear normal in the morning light, just tired brown orbs that show no trace of their nighttime transformation, but I can feel it waiting inside me, this change that emerges with the darkness, growing stronger each time the sun sets and the highways call to those of us who drive through the night. I don't know what we're becoming, we drivers whose eyes shine like beacons in the darkness. I don't know if we're the first of our kind or part of something that's been happening for years, decades, perhaps since the first highways were built and the first truckers began their nocturnal migrations across the continent. All I know is that when night falls again, I'll be back on the road, my cargo secure and my route planned. My glowing eyes scanning the darkness for signs of others like me. The highways are calling, and those of us with the night vision to see where they truly lead have no choice but to answer. Whatever we're becoming, whatever purpose these changes serve, I have a feeling that the transformation is just beginning. And somewhere out there in the darkness, others are discovering what it means to see the road as it really is, illuminated not by headlights, but by eyes that burn like green fire in the endless American night. The Passenger Who Never Arrived, from Daniel Kowalski. The woman in white first appeared in my headlights somewhere between Amarillo and Oklahoma City, standing beside Interstate 40 in the pre-dawn darkness with her thumb extended toward the endless stream of eastbound traffic. My Freightliner Cascadia was running empty after delivering a load of wind turbine components to a Texas wind farm, and the absence of weight in the trailer made every bump and crosswind feel amplified through the cab. The digital clock on my dashboard showed 3:47 IUM, that dead hour when the world belonged to long-haul truckers and the occasional insomniac traveling between cities that exist only as clusters of light against the vast darkness of the Great Plains. I'd been driving for nearly 6 hours straight, pushing against my logbook limits to make good time toward a pickup in Little Rock, when I first caught sight of her pale figure illuminated against the scrub grass and barbed wire fencing that lined this desolate stretch of highway. She wore what appeared to be a wedding dress, the white fabric flowing around her like captured moonlight, and she stood perfectly still, with an otherworldly patience that made me ease off the accelerator and consider what kind of desperation would put a woman in formal attire beside a highway in the middle of nowhere. The CB radio crackled with static as I downshifted, the Jake brake engaging with its familiar rumbling growl. Channel 19 had been quiet for the past hour, unusual for this heavily traveled corridor. But now, a voice emerged from the white noise, distorted and barely audible above the interference. Eastbound Freightliner approaching mile marker 89, you got your ears on? The transmission was weak, fading in and out like a signal from a distant galaxy, but the urgency in the caller's tone was unmistakable. I keyed the microphone, glancing at the mile marker posts flashing past in my peripheral vision. This is eastbound Freightliner, go ahead. Driver, you need to keep moving past that hitchhiker. Don't stop, don't even slow down, trust me on this one, good buddy. But by the time the transmission came through clearly, I was already committed to stopping. The woman had turned toward my approaching headlights, raising her hand in a gesture that seemed more like a benediction than a typical hitchhiker's wave. And something about her posture suggested a dignity that transcended her obviously desperate circumstances. My conscience wouldn't allow me to drive past someone stranded in such a remote location, regardless of how they'd ended up there. I brought the rig to a gentle stop on the shoulder, air brakes hissing as 18 wheels settled onto the rough asphalt. Through my passenger side window, I could see her walking toward the cab with measured steps that seemed to glide rather than touch the ground. The wedding dress moved around her in ways that suggested a breeze, though the night air was perfectly still, and her dark hair fell in waves that framed a face of such ethereal beauty that I found myself questioning whether I was fully awake. "Thank you for stopping," she said as I rolled down the passenger window. Her voice carried the soft accent of the Deep South, musical and warm despite the circumstances. "I know it's unusual to see someone like me out here, but I'm trying to get to New Orleans. My fiancée is waiting for me there." "New Orleans is a long way from here, miss," I replied, studying her features in the dome light. She appeared to be in her 20s, with skin so pale it seemed to emit its own faint luminescence, and eyes that reflected the interior lights of my cab with an almost liquid quality. "What happened to your transportation?" A shadow passed across her face, a fleeting expression of sorrow that made her seem suddenly vulnerable. "There was an accident," she said quietly. "My car, it's not drivable anymore. Please, I know it's an imposition, but I have to get to New Orleans by sunrise. The wedding is this morning." Something about her story didn't quite align with logic. No woman planning a morning wedding would be traveling alone in her dress the night before, and the nearest town was at least 50 miles in either direction. But the desperate sincerity in her voice overrode my skepticism. I've picked up stranded motorists before, usually men whose vehicles had broken down or who'd run out of fuel, but never anyone in circumstances quite like thee. "I'm not going all the way to New Orleans," I told her, "but I can get you to Little Rock. From there you should be able to catch a bus or find another ride." "That would be wonderful," she said, and when she smiled, the expression transformed her entire face with a radiance that seemed to push back the surrounding darkness. "Thank you so much, you're very kind." I reached across to unlock the passenger door, and she climbed into the cab with a fluid grace that barely disturbed the air inside. As she settled into the seat, I noticed that despite having been standing beside the highway for what must have been hours, her dress showed no signs of dust or wear, and she carried no luggage, purse, or personal belongings of any kind. The wedding gown itself was exquisite, clearly expensive, with intricate lacework and beadwork that caught the dashboard lights like captured stars. "I'm Daniel," I said, putting the rig back in gear and checking my mirrors before pulling onto the highway. "Elizabeth," she replied, smoothing the fabric of her dress with movements that seemed almost ritualistic. "Elizabeth Hartwell. I was born in New Orleans, but I've been living in California for the past few years. I came back home for the wedding." As we accelerated back to highway speed, I found myself stealing glances at my unusual passenger. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, gazing out the windshield at the darkness ahead with an expression of intense concentration, as if she were searching for something just beyond the reach of our headlight. The air in the cab had grown noticeably cooler since she'd entered, though the climate control system was working normally, and there was a faint scent that reminded me of magnolia blossoms in old churches. "So what kind of work do you do in California?" I asked, trying to maintain normal conversation despite the increasingly surreal nature of the situation. "I was a teacher," she said without turning from the windshield. "Elementary school. I loved working with children, helping them discover the world and all its possibilities. But that life is over now. Everything changed when I met William." "William is your fiancé?" "Yes. We met at a charity function last spring. He's from one of the old New Orleans families, the kind that traced their lineage back to before the Civil War. When he proposed, I knew I had to leave everything behind and start a new life with him." Her voice carried a dreamy quality, as if she were recounting events from long ago rather than recent experiences. The more she spoke, the more I became aware of subtle inconsistencies in her story and appearance. Her speech patterns seemed to belong to an earlier era, formal and precise in ways that modern conversation rarely achieved. The wedding dress, while beautiful, had a vintage quality that suggested it might be decades old rather than recently purchased. We'd been driving for about 30 minutes when the CB radio crackled to life again, the same distorted voice that had tried to warn me earlier. "Freightliner with the eastbound empty trailer, you copy?" I glanced at Elizabeth, who showed no reaction to the transmission, then keyed the microphone. "Go ahead." "Driver, I hope you didn't pick up that hitchhiker back there. Every trucker who's stopped for her in the past 20 years has had the same experience, and it never ends well." 20 years? I said into the microphone, feeling Elizabeth's attention shift toward me for the first time since entering the cab. "That stretch of highway where you saw her, that's where Elizabeth Hartwell died in a car accident in 1994. Single vehicle crash happened during a thunderstorm while she was driving from California to New Orleans for her wedding. They say she's been trying to complete that journey ever since, but she never makes it to her destination. Drivers who pick her up report that she just disappears sometime before they reach wherever they're taking her." I looked across the cab at my passenger, expecting to see shock, anger, or some other normal human reaction to such an accusation. Instead, Elizabeth was studying me with an expression of infinite sadness, her ethereal features seeming to grow more transparent in the dashboard light. "You know, don't you?" she said softly. "You've known since you picked me up that something wasn't quite right." My hands tightened on the steering wheel as a chill that had nothing to do with temperature ran down my spine. "Elizabeth, what year do you think this is?" 1994, she replied without hesitation. "October 15th, 1994. I'm supposed to be married this morning at St. Louis Cathedral. William will be waiting for me at the altar, along with all our friends and family. I can't be late. I've already been late for so many things." The speedometer showed that we were traveling at exactly 70 miles per hour, but the mile markers outside seemed to be passing more slowly than they should, as if the highway itself were stretching to accommodate our journey. The radio had gone silent again, and when I tried to raise other drivers on different channels, I heard nothing but empty static. "Elizabeth," I said carefully, "what do you remember about the accident?" "The rain came so suddenly," she said, her voice taking on the distant quality of someone lost in memory. "The windshield wipers couldn't keep up with it, and the road became like a river. I was driving too fast, I know that now, but I was so afraid of being late. The car started to slide, and I remember trying to steer into the skid like my father taught me, but it wasn't enough. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the headlights of an oncoming truck." As she spoke, I became aware that the temperature in the cab was continuing to drop, and my breath was beginning to form small clouds in the air. The scent of magnolias had grown stronger, mixed now with the smell of rain and something else. Something that reminded me of old graveyards and forgotten prayers. "You're trying to get home," I said, understanding beginning to dawn on me. "You've been trying to get home for 30 years. "Time moves strangely when you're caught between destinations," she replied. "Sometimes it feels like I've been standing beside that highway for minutes, sometimes for decades. But the urgency never fades. I have to get to New Orleans." "William is waiting." The highway ahead began to look different, the modern interstate gradually taking on the appearance of an older road, the asphalt becoming rougher, the guardrails changing from contemporary metal barriers to older wooden posts and cables. When I glanced at my GPS unit, the screen showed nothing but static, and the digital displays on my dashboard had begun to flicker and dim. "This isn't really 2025, is it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Time isn't fixed for people like me," Elizabeth said. "I exist in the moment of my greatest need, my most desperate desire. Every driver who stops for me experiences that moment with me, becomes part of my journey, for as long as they're willing to help." As she spoke, I realized that she was becoming more transparent, her features growing fainter, as if she were made of morning mist that the rising sun would soon burn away. Through her increasingly ghostly form, I could see the passenger seat beneath her, the door handle, the window beyond. "What happens when you reach New Orleans?" I asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never made it that far. Something always happens before I arrive. The driver realizes what I am and puts me out, or the sun comes up and I fade away, or we reach some boundary that I can't cross. But I keep trying because I have to believe that someday, somehow, I'll make it to the cathedral in time." The road signs we passed now showed destinations I didn't recognize, and when I looked in my mirrors, the highway behind us had disappeared into a fog that seemed to follow our truck like a living thing. The only reality that remained was the narrow cone of light cast by our headlights and the increasingly ghostly woman beside me who had been trying to get home for 3 decades. "Elizabeth," I said, "what if William isn't waiting anymore? What if 30 years have passed and he's moved on with his life?" She turned to look at me then, and in her eyes I saw not just sadness, but a profound acceptance of truths she'd been trying to avoid. "Then I suppose I'll have to learn to let go," she said. "But until I know for certain, until I can see the cathedral steps for myself, I have to keep trying." We drove in silence for what felt like hours, though the clock on my dashboard had stopped working, its hands frozen at 3:47 dot. The world outside had taken on a dreamlike quality, with landscapes that shifted between different decades, different seasons, different realities entirely. Sometimes I saw the modern interstate with its truck stops and fast food restaurants, sometimes a 2-lane highway through Depression-era farmland, and sometimes roads that seemed to exist outside of time altogether. "I'm fading," Elizabeth said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. "I can feel it happening. The sun must be coming up. I looked to the east and saw the first pale hints of dawn touching the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold. As the light grew stronger, Elizabeth became more translucent, her white dress merging with the morning mist, until she seemed like nothing more than a reflection on the passenger window. "Will I see you again?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear the answer. "Perhaps," she said, her voice now distant and ethereal. "If you're ever driving through Texas again on a night when the moon is dark and the highway feels longer than it should, I'll be there, beside the road, still trying to get home." And then she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of magnolias and the memory of her desperate hope. The passenger seat was empty, the door still locked, and when I looked at my GPS, it showed my position exactly where it should be on Interstate 40, approaching Little Rock, as the sun painted the Arkansas sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. But sometimes, on long nights when the highway stretches endlessly ahead and the radio crackles with voices from distant places, I find myself looking for a woman in white beside the road, still searching for a ride to a wedding that may never come to pass. And I know that if I see her again, despite everything I've learned about the danger of picking up passengers who exist between worlds, I'll stop, because some journeys are too important to abandon, even when they lead nowhere but deeper into the mystery of what we leave behind when we can't let go of where we were trying to go. The Night Shift at mile 127. From Tommy Chen. The fuel gauge on my Mac Anthem showed less than an eighth of a tank when I spotted the blue and white sign for Morrison's Gas rising from the darkness along Interstate 80 through Nevada's high desert. It was nearly 2 in the morning, that desolate hour when the highway belongs to long-haul truckers and the occasional night owl driving between cities separated by hundreds of miles of sagebrush and alkali flats. My load of electronics bound for Reno had kept me running later than planned, and the next truck stop wasn't for another 60 miles according to my atlas, far enough to make fuel conservation a serious concern given the headwinds I'd been fighting since leaving Salt Lake City. The off-ramp curved down through a landscape of Joshua trees and weathered rock formations, their twisted shapes casting strange shadows in my headlights as I descended toward the solitary beacon of Morrison's Gas. The station sat alone in a shallow valley, its fluorescent canopy casting a harsh white glow over 4 fuel islands that looked like they'd been installed sometime in the 1980s. A small convenience store occupied the center of the property, its windows blazing with the kind of unforgiving light that made everything inside look sterile and unwelcoming. But after 12 hours of driving through the Nevada wilderness, even this isolated outpost felt like civilization. I guided my rig toward the diesel pumps at the far end of the property, the air brakes hissing as I brought 18 wheels to a stop beside pump number 7. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of electrical transformers. No wind stirred the desert air. No insects buzzed around the overhead lights, and the usual sounds of highway traffic were muted by distance and the surrounding hills. It was the kind of absolute quiet that city dwellers never experience. A silence so complete it seemed to press against the eardrums with its own weight. As I climbed down from the cab and stretched muscles stiff from hours behind the wheel, I noticed that mine was the only vehicle at the station. No other trucks, no cars, not even the attendant's personal vehicle visible anywhere on the property. The pumps looked functional enough, but there were no price displays showing current fuel costs, and when I tried to activate the diesel dispenser with my credit card, nothing happened. The screen remained dark, unresponsive to my attempts to begin the fueling process. Through the convenience store windows, I could see shelves stocked with the usual assortment of snacks, beverages, and automotive supplies, but no sign of human activity inside. The interior lights cast everything in that familiar harsh glow that made truck stop food look even less appetizing than usual, but there was something else about the scene that troubled me, something I couldn't immediately identify. The displays were too perfect, too carefully arranged, as if they were part of a museum exhibit rather than a working retail establishment. A bell chimed as I pushed through the glass door, the sound echoing in the empty store with unusual clarity. The air inside carried the familiar sense of coffee, hot dogs rotating on warming rollers, and the vague chemical odor of industrial cleaning products. But underneath these expected aromas was something else. Something organic and slightly sweet that reminded me of flowers left too long in stagnant water. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a frequency that seemed to burrow into my skull, and I found myself squinting against their intensity, despite having just come from the darkness outside. "Evening, driver," came a voice from behind the counter, though I hadn't seen anyone there when I entered. "Quite a night for traveling, isn't it?" I turned to see a man in his 40s standing behind the cash register, wearing the kind of uniform shirt the gas station attendants have worn for decades, blue polyester with a name tag that read Carl in white letters. His appearance was unremarkable in most ways: medium height, brown hair neatly combed, a face that seemed pleasant enough, but there was something about his posture that struck me as odd. He stood too straight, too still, like a mannequin positioned for display rather than a living person engaged in the casual movements that characterize human behavior. "I need diesel," I said, approaching the counter. "Pump 7, but the credit card reader isn't working." "Oh, we don't take plastic after midnight," Carl replied with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Cash only during the night shift. Company policy, you understand. Too many problems with the electronic systems out here in the desert, all that electromagnetic interference from the mountains." His explanation seemed reasonable enough, though I'd never encountered a truck stop that discontinued credit card service during certain hours. I pulled my wallet from my back pocket and counted the bills inside. Enough cash for fuel, though it would leave me running light on emergency funds until I could find an ATM in Reno. "How much for a full tank?" I asked. "Depends on what you're hauling," Carl said, his head tilting slightly to one side, like a bird studying an unusual object. "Heavy load puts more strain on the engine, burns fuel faster, creates more wear and tear on the equipment. Light load, well, that's easier on everything." The comment struck me as strange. Gas station attendants typically didn't concern themselves with the specifics of a customer's cargo or the mechanical implications of different load weights. They sold fuel, collected payment, and sent drivers on their way with minimal conversation. But Carl seemed genuinely interested in the details of my journey, watching me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Electronics," I said. "Nothing too heavy. Just need to top off the tank and get back on the road." "Electronics," Carl repeated, as if the word held special significance. Fascinating what people can create these days. Machines that think, devices that connect minds across vast distances, artificial intelligences that learn and adapt. Makes you wonder where it all leads, doesn't it? What happens when the created becomes more sophisticated than the creator? I nodded politely, though his philosophical musings seemed oddly out of place in a desert gas station at 2 in the morning. "Could you turn on pump 7? I'd like to fuel up and get moving." Of course," Carl said, reaching beneath the counter for what I assumed was the pump activation control. "Though I have to ask, have you noticed anything unusual tonight? During your drive, I mean. Any strange sensations, odd perceptions, feelings that things aren't quite as they should be?" The question sent a chill down my spine. They had nothing to do with the air conditioning. There had been something different about the past few hours on the highway. Subtle changes in the way the landscape looked, the way sounds carried through the desert air, the way my own thoughts seemed to echo inside my skull with unusual clarity. But these were the kinds of experiences that came with extreme fatigue and long hours of concentration, not the sort of thing to discuss with a stranger. "Just tired," I said. "Long day on the road." "Fatigue can be deceptive," Carl observed, his smile widening slightly. Sometimes what we attribute to exhaustion is actually heightened awareness, enhanced perception. The mind becomes more receptive to influences that normally remain below the threshold of consciousness. As he spoke, I became increasingly aware that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. The way Carl's lips moved didn't quite synchronize with the words I heard, as if there were a slight delay between the physical act of speaking and the transmission of sound. His eyes, which had seemed pleasant enough at first glance, never blinked, maintaining a fixed stare that suggested the unnatural focus of a predator studying prey. "I'll just pay for the fuel and be on my way," I said, placing $50 on the counter. Carl picked up the bills with movements that seemed too fluid, too precise, like a machine designed to mimic human gestures without fully understanding their natural rhythm. As his fingers touched the money, I noticed that his skin had an unusual quality, too smooth and uniform in color, lacking the small imperfections and variations that characterize human flesh. "You know," he said, holding the bills up to the fluorescent light as if checking for counterfeits, "we don't get many travelers through here during the night shift. Most people prefer to fuel up at the larger truck stops, places with more amenities, more social interaction. But there's something to be said for the solitude of places like this, don't you think? The peace that comes from being far from the crowds and complications of modern life." Through the store windows, I could see my truck waiting beside Pump 7, its chrome and paint gleaming under the harsh lights of the fuel canopy. The sight of my rig provided a measure of comfort, a reminder that escape was just a few steps away once I completed this transaction. But as I watched, something about the scene outside began to trouble me. The shadows cast by my truck seemed wrong somehow, falling at angles that didn't match the position of the overhead lights. "The pump should be active now," Carl said, though I hadn't seen him operate any controls. "Take your time fueling up. No need to rush. The night is still young and the highway will be there when you're ready." I headed for the door, eager to complete the fueling process and return to the familiar environment of my cab. But Carl's voice stopped me before I could reach the exit. "Driver," he called, and when I turned back, his appearance had subtly changed. His uniform looked more faded than it had moments before, as if years of washing had leached the color from the fabric. His name tag now read Charles instead of Carl, and his face seemed different too, older, with features that didn't quite match my memory of what he'd looked like when I first entered the store. "Yes," I said, my hand resting on the door handle. "Be careful out there on the highway. Sometimes the road takes travelers places they didn't expect to go, shows them things they weren't prepared to see. Not everyone who stops here makes it to their intended destination." The warning sent another chill through me, but I pushed through the door without responding, stepping back into the desert night where the silence seemed even more profound than before. As I walked toward my truck, I noticed that the air temperature had dropped significantly, despite the fact that Nevada's high desert typically remained warm well into the night during summer months. My breath formed small clouds in the suddenly frigid air, and frost was beginning to form on the metal surfaces of the fuel pumps. The diesel nozzle activated normally when I lifted it from the pump, and fuel began flowing into my tank, with the familiar sound of rushing liquid and mechanical clicking from the meter. But as I stood there in the cold, watching the numbers climb on the pump display, I became aware of sounds that hadn't been present earlier. Soft whispers seemed to emerge from the desert darkness beyond the station's lights, voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, discussing topics I couldn't understand. When I glanced back at the convenience store, Charles or Carl, or whatever his name really was, stood at the window watching me with that same unblinking stare. But now there were others with him, shadowy figures visible just at the edges of perception, all wearing similar uniforms, all maintaining that same predatory focus. As I watched, they began to multiply, filling the store with dozens of identical attendants, each one a slight variation of the same basic template. The fuel pump clicked off, indicating a full tank, But when I tried to remove the nozzle, it wouldn't release from my truck's fuel port. I tugged at it gently, then with increasing force, but the connection seemed to have fused somehow, as if the metal components had bonded at a molecular level. Through the store windows, the army of attendants continued to watch, their numbers growing until they pressed against the glass like a crowd at a sporting event. That's when I realized that the fuel still flowing into my tank despite the pump having clicked off and the liquid emerging from the nozzle was no longer the familiar golden color of diesel fuel. Instead, it ran thick and dark, with an iridescent quality that shifted between colors as it caught the light from the overhead canopy. The substance gave off an odor that reminded me of burning electronics mixed with something organic and decay-sweet, the same scent I'd noticed in the store but now concentrated and overwhelming. I abandoned the fuel nozzle and ran for my cab, fumbling with the door handle as the whispers from the darkness grew louder and more urgent. Behind me I could hear the sound of the convenience store door opening and closing repeatedly, accompanied by the shuffling footsteps of multiple figures moving across the asphalt. I didn't look back as I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, but in my mirrors I could see them emerging from the store. Dozens of identical attendants in faded uniforms, all moving with that same unnaturally fluid gait. My truck started immediately, the diesel engine roaring to life with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the desert's silence. I put the transmission in gear and accelerated away from the fuel island, leaving the nozzle still attached to my fuel port, dragging behind the truck like some mechanical umbilical cord. In my mirrors, I watched the attendants standing motionless under the fluorescent lights, their faces turned upward toward the sky, as if listening for signals from distant sources. The on-ramp back to Interstate 80 appeared in my headlights exactly where it should have been, and within minutes I was back on the familiar asphalt of the highway, surrounded by the normal sounds of wind and engine noise. The fuel gauge showed a full tank despite my abbreviated stop, and when I checked my mirrors, there was no sign of the nozzle that had been attached to my truck during the escape from Morrison's Gap. But even now, hours later as I write this account in a well-lit truck stop outside Reno, I can still smell traces of that sweet decay odor in my cab, and sometimes I catch glimpses of figures in gas station uniforms standing at the edges of parking lots, watching the highway with patient, predatory eyes. The fuel in my tank burns normally, propels my truck at highway speeds without any mechanical problems, but I can't shake the feeling that it's more than just refined petroleum product flowing through my engine. Whatever I took on at that isolated station in the Nevada desert, whatever substance those things that looked like gas station attendants pumped into my truck, I suspect it's changing more than just the chemical composition of my fuel. Sometimes, late at night, when the highway stretches endlessly ahead and the CB radio crackles with voices from distant places, I find myself wondering if I'm still the same person who stopped for fuel at mile marker 127, or if something fundamental about my nature was altered during those few minutes under the fluorescent lights of Morrison's Gas. The highway calls to drivers like us, promising destinations and deliveries, but sometimes the real journey isn't to the places marked on our bills of lading. Sometimes we're traveling toward transformations we never intended, carrying cargo that was loaded into our lives by attendants who wear human faces but serve purposes we're not equipped to understand. And the most unsettling part is that we might never know when the delivery is complete. The Silent Passenger. From Sarah Mitchell. The girl appeared in my headlights like a specter materializing from the fog that rolled across Highway 101 through the redwood forests of Northern California. It was just past midnight on a Tuesday in late October, the kind of night when the Pacific mist transforms familiar landscapes into something alien and unknowable, reducing visibility to mere yards ahead of my Volvo V&L's chrome bumper. I'd been hauling organic produce from Salinas to Portland, running behind schedule due to a delayed loading dock and the kind of paperwork snarls that seem to multiply whenever you're already pressed for time. The fog had been thickening for the past hour, forcing me to reduce speed to barely 40 miles per hour as I navigated the winding mountain highway that carved through some of the most ancient forests on Earth. Trees that had been standing since before Columbus reached the Americas loomed on either side of the asphalt, their massive trunks disappearing into the gray-white curtain that seemed to muffle every sound except the steady diesel rumble of my engine and the rhythmic sweep of windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the moisture-laden air. She stood directly in the center of my lane, about 50 yards ahead, perfectly motionless, despite the dangerous position she occupied on a highway where visibility was nearly zero. My first instinct was to lay on the horn and assume she would jump to safety, but something about her posture suggested she had no intention of moving. Instead of the startled reaction I expected from someone caught in headlights, she simply stood there with her arms at her sides, facing my approaching truck with a stillness that seemed more like acceptance than shock. I downshifted and applied the brakes gently, feeling the weight of my loaded trailer pushing against the tractor as we decelerated through the fog. The air brakes hissed their familiar protest, and the Jake brake engaged with its characteristic rumbling growl, but the girl never flinched or attempted to move out of the roadway. As I drew closer, I could see that she appeared to be a teenager, maybe 16 or 17 years old, wearing jeans and a dark sweatshirt that made her almost invisible against the night, except for the pale oval of her upturned face. I brought the rig to a complete stop about 10 feet from where she stood, leaving the headlights on to provide illumination in the otherwise impenetrable darkness. The fog swirled around her like something alive, creating patterns that seemed to respond to her presence in ways that defied the random nature of air currents and moisture. Through my windshield, I could see her more clearly now, and what I observed made my breath catch in my throat. Dark streaks ran from both of her eyes down her cheeks, visible even in the harsh glare of my headlights. At first, I assumed it was makeup, perhaps some kind of gothic fashion statement, but as I studied her face more carefully, I realized the dark lines had the consistency and flow pattern of liquid. She was bleeding from her eyes, a steady seepage that should have been accompanied by obvious distress, yet her expression remained eerily calm, almost serene. I climbed down from the cab, leaving the engine running and the hazard lights flashing to warn any other traffic that might emerge from the fog behind us. The air outside was thick with moisture and the scent of redwood bark, ferns, and something else I couldn't immediately identify. Something metallic and slightly sweet that reminded me of old pennies left in water. "Hey," I called out, approaching her cautiously. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" She turned her head toward me with a movement so fluid it seemed to lack the normal mechanical constraints of human anatomy. Her eyes were wide and dark, the irises so deep brown they were almost black, and from the inner corners of each eye thin streams of what appeared to be blood flowed steadily down her face. But despite this disturbing symptom, her gaze held an intelligence and awareness that suggested she was fully conscious and alert. "Can you hear me?" I asked, stopping about arm's length away. "My name is Sarah. I'm a truck driver. What's your name?" She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no sound emerged. Her lips moved in what might have been an attempt at speech, but the only result was a slight increase in the flow from her eyes, the dark liquid dripping more rapidly onto the front of her sweatshirt. She raised one hand toward me in a gesture that seemed both pleading and warning, her fingers trembling with what might have been effort or fear. The rational part of my mind insisted that I was looking at someone who needed immediate medical attention, a teenager who had suffered some kind of injury or illness that required professional treatment. But there was something about her presence that triggered deeper instincts, primitive warnings that had kept our species alive through millennia of evolution. Every fiber of my being wanted to return to my truck and drive away, to leave this strange encounter in the fog-shrouded darkness and never look back. Instead, I found myself moving closer, drawn by a combination of curiosity and compassion that overrode my growing unease. "Are you lost? Is there somewhere I can take you? A hospital maybe? Or your parents' house?" Again she attempted to speak, her mouth forming words that produced no audible sound. The bleeding from her eyes increased, and I noticed that the liquid hitting the asphalt beneath her feet wasn't behaving like normal blood. Instead of soaking into the porous surface or forming the kind of puddles I would have expected, it seemed to maintain its cohesion, creating dark patterns that looked almost like symbols or letters in some unfamiliar alphabet. That's when I realized that the fog around us had begun to change. What had been a formless gray mass was now taking on structure and movement, swirling in patterns that seemed to center on the girl's location. Tendrils of mist reached toward her like ghostly fingers, and within the larger fog bank, I began to see shapes that might have been other figures, shadowy forms that appeared and vanished at the edges of my vision. "We need to get you out of the road," I said, extending my hand toward her. "It's not safe standing here in the fog. Someone could hit you." She looked at my outstretched hand with an expression of profound sadness, then shook her head slowly. When she raised her own hand to meet mine, I noticed that her skin was unnaturally cold, and her fingers felt more like smooth stone than human flesh. The contact lasted only seconds, but in that brief moment, I experienced something that I still struggle to describe. Images flooded my mind, scenes that weren't from my own memory but felt as vivid and real as my own experiences. I saw the same stretch of highway, but from different time periods. The road as it had appeared decades earlier, when it was just a narrow 2-lane path through the forest, and even further back, when there was no road at all, just game trails winding between the massive trees. In each vision, the girl was present, always standing in the same location, always with those dark streams flowing from her eyes, always reaching out to travelers who passed through her domain. I saw other drivers who had encountered her over the years, truckers and families and lone travelers who had stopped to offer help, and found themselves drawn into something far beyond their understanding. Some had simply driven away after brief encounters, while others had lingered longer, trying to understand what they were witnessing, but in every case the interaction had left marks on them, changes that manifested in different ways depending on how deeply they had allowed themselves to become involved. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving me standing in the fog with my hand still touching hers, but now I understood that I wasn't looking at an injured teenager in need of assistance. This was something far older, something that had been part of this forest long before the highway was built, long before the first European settlers had arrived to name these mountains and valleys. "You're not human, are you?" I said, though it wasn't really a question. She smiled then, the first change in expression I had seen since stopping my truck, and the smile was both beautiful and terrible. Her lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were too sharp, too numerous, arranged in patterns that no human mouth should accommodate. The bleeding from her eyes increased to a steady flow, but now I could see that the liquid wasn't blood at all but something darker, something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I tried to pull my hand away from hers but found that I couldn't break the contact. Her fingers, which had felt cold and smooth moments before, now seemed to be changing texture, becoming rougher, more like bark than skin. The fog around us grew thicker, and within its swirling mass I could now clearly see the other figures I had glimpsed earlier. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, all standing silently in the mist, all bleeding from their eyes in steady streams that fed the darkness growing beneath our feet. "What do you want from me?" I asked, fighting the panic that threatened to overwhelm my ability to think clearly. She opened her mouth again, and this time sound did emerge, but it wasn't speech in any language I recognized. Instead, it was a low humming that seemed to come from multiple sources, a harmony that involved not just her voice, but the voices of all the figures surrounding us in the fog. The sound resonated through the forest, causing the massive redwoods to vibrate in sympathy, their ancient wood adding deeper bass notes to the otherworldly chorus. As the humming continued, I became aware that my own vision was beginning to change. The world around me grew sharper, more defined, but also somehow different in ways I couldn't immediately identify. colors seemed more vivid, edges more distinct, and I found that I could see clearly through the fog that had been impenetrable just minutes earlier. But with this enhanced perception came the realization that what I was seeing wasn't entirely natural. The highway beneath our feet was older than it should have been, worn by the passage of countless travelers over periods of time that stretched back far beyond the official construction date. The forest around us was filled with pathways that didn't appear on any map, ancient routes that connected this location to other places, other times, other realities entirely. And everywhere I looked, I saw evidence of those who had passed this way before, travelers who had encountered the girl and her silent companions and been changed by the experience. I understood then that I was being offered a choice, though the nature of that choice wasn't entirely clear. I could resist whatever transformation was being offered, fight against the changes I could feel beginning in my own perception, and possibly escape back to the familiar world of highways and truck stops and scheduled deliveries. Or I could accept what was happening, allow myself to become part of whatever ancient network existed in these forests, join the ranks of those who watched the roads and occasionally reached out to passing travelers. The girl's grip on my hand tightened, and I felt more images flowing into my consciousness. I saw truck drivers from previous decades who had made the choice to stay, abandoning their rigs and their old lives to become guardians of hidden pathways through the forest. I saw families who had taken wrong turns and found themselves in places that existed between the official maps, discovering communities that thrived in the spaces modern civilization had forgotten. And I saw others who had chosen to return to their normal lives, but carried with them forever the knowledge that there was more to the world than what appeared on the surface. I have responsibilities, I said, though my voice sounded distant and strange to my own ears. People are expecting this load in Portland. My company will be looking for me if I don't check in. The humming grew louder, more complex, and I realized that it wasn't just sound, but communication, a language that bypassed the need for words and spoke directly to something deeper than conscious thought. Through this strange chorus, I began to understand that time worked differently in this place, that the fog and the forest existed partially outside the normal flow of hours and days. What seemed like an extended encounter might translate to just moments in the world I had left behind, or, conversely, a brief decision here might echo across years of consequences in the life I would return to. The choice was mine, but it had to be made now, while the fog still held and the pathways between worlds remained open. I looked into the girl's dark eyes, seeing in their depths reflections of roads I had never traveled, destinations that didn't appear on any atlas, possibilities that stretched beyond the boundaries of everything I thought I understood about existence. Finally, with great effort, I pulled my hand free from hers and stepped backward toward my truck. The movement broke whatever spell had held me in place, and immediately the fog began to thin. The humming faded to a whisper, and the shadowy figures surrounding us started to dissolve back into formless mist. The girl watched me retreat with that same sad smile, raising her hand in what might have been farewell or invitation. I climbed back into my cab and put the transmission in gear, driving slowly forward through the space where she had been standing. In my mirrors, I could see her still there, growing smaller and more translucent as the distance increased, until she was nothing more than a pale shape in the swirling fog. But even after she disappeared from view, I could feel her presence, awareness that followed me through the forest like a patient shadow. The fog lifted completely about 20 miles down the highway, revealing the familiar landscape of Northern California's coastal mountains under a star-filled sky. My GPS showed normal time progression, my logbook indicated no unusual delays, and when I called dispatch to report my progress, everything seemed perfectly routine. But something fundamental had changed during those minutes in the fog, something that manifested in small ways over the following days and weeks. My night vision became sharper, allowing me to spot hazards and road conditions with unusual clarity, even in complete darkness. I began to notice pathways and side roads that I had never seen before during countless trips along the same routes. Alternate routes that seemed to lead to destinations not marked on official maps. And sometimes, late at night when the highway was empty and the CB radio carried only static, I could hear that humming again, faint but unmistakable, calling from fog banks and forest groves where the normal rules didn't quite apply. I still drive the same routes, deliver the same types of cargo, maintain the same professional relationships with dispatchers and dock workers and fellow drivers. But now, I know that there are passengers on these highways who aren't looking for rides to conventional destinations. And some encounters change you in ways that can never be undone. The girl with the bleeding eyes is still out there. I'm certain of it. Standing in the fog on nights when the boundary between worlds grows thin, offering choices to travelers who are ready to discover what lies beyond the edges of the maps we trust to guide us home. The Voice on Channel 19. From Jake Rodriguez. The CB radio in my Peterbilt 379 had been acting strange for the better part of 3 hours as I rolled through the Montana Badlands on a starless Thursday night in November. What started as occasional bursts of static during conversations with other drivers had evolved into something far more unsettling. Moments when the channel selector would turn by itself, the volume knob would adjust without my touch, and voices would emerge from the speaker that belonged to no one I could identify on the highway around me. My load of construction equipment bound for Billings kept me running through the night, but the isolation of this particular stretch of Interstate 94 was beginning to feel less like peaceful solitude and more like something actively malevolent. The first sign of trouble had appeared around midnight, just after I'd passed through Miles City and entered the vast emptiness that separates Montana's small communities, like islands in an ocean of prairie grass and rolling hills. I'd been listening to the usual chatter on Channel 19, the informal network that connects long-haul truckers across the continent, with reports of speed traps, weather conditions, and the kind of casual conversation that helps pass the endless hours of highway driving. But then my radio began picking up transmissions that didn't fit the normal patterns of trucker communication. The voices were older, speaking in the formal cadences of an earlier era, discussing routes and road conditions for highways that didn't match current numbering systems. They talked about truck stops that had been closed for decades, warned about construction zones on roads that had been completed years ago, and shared information about fuel prices that were impossibly low by today's standard. At first I assumed I was picking up some kind of atmospheric skip, radio signals from distant locations that had bounced off the ionosphere and landed in my receiver. But as the transmissions continued, I realized they were discussing the exact stretch of highway I was currently traveling. Eastbound Peterbilt approaching, mile marker 126, you got your ears on? The voice emerged from my speaker with the clarity of a local transmission, despite the fact that my CB scanner showed no other vehicles within a 20-mile radius. The accent was distinctly Midwestern, but with pronunciations and phrasing that seemed to belong to the 1970s or early 1980s. I keyed my microphone, glancing at the mile markers flashing past in my headlights. This is eastbound Peterbilt, go ahead. Driver, you need to be aware of severe weather moving in from the northwest. Ice storms been building for the past 2 hours, and visibility's dropping fast. Road conditions are deteriorating rapidly between Glendive and Terry. I checked my weather radio and GPS display, both of which showed clear skies and normal conditions for the next 100 miles. The outside temperature gauge read 38 degrees, well above freezing, and the forecast I'd received at my last fuel stop indicated partly cloudy skies with no precipitation expected until the weekend. I'm not seeing any weather issues, I replied into the microphone. Conditions look good from here. Trust me on this one, driver. I've been running this route longer than most people have been alive. The storm's coming whether your modern instruments show it or not. You'd be wise to find shelter soon. As if summoned by the anonymous trucker's warning, the first snowflakes began to appear in my headlights, sparse at first, but quickly increasing in density and size. Within minutes, what had been a clear November night transformed into a swirling white maelstrom that reduced visibility to barely the length of my truck and trailer. The temperature gauge plummeted from 38 degrees to 12 in the space of a few miles, and ice began forming on my windshield despite the constant sweep of the wipers. My CB radio crackled again, but this time the voice was different, belonging to someone who sounded much younger, perhaps a driver who had just started his career. Breaker 19, this is westbound Kenworth. Looking for information about that accident near Terry. Any drivers got eyes on the situation? I hadn't heard any previous reports about an accident, and according to my GPS, Terry was still 40 miles ahead. But before I could respond, another voice joined the conversation, this one belonging to an older woman with a slight southern accent. Westbound Ken, that accident cleared up about an hour ago. Single vehicle rollover, driver walked away with minor injuries. Road's open, but they're still cleaning up debris in the right lane. Much obliged, driver. How are conditions further east? Bit nasty fast, ice building up on the overpasses, and the wind starting to pick up. Y'all be careful out there. As this conversation unfolded, I noticed something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The channel selector on my CB radio was turning by itself, moving slowly from channel 19 to channel 17, then to channel 21, as if invisible hands were searching for better reception. The volume knob also began adjusting on its own, turning up and down in rhythm with the transmissions, fine-tuning the audio quality without any input from me. I reached for the radio to manually adjust the controls, but the moment my fingers touched the channel selector, I received a mild electric shock that made me jerk my hand back. The metal surface of the radio felt unusually cold, much colder than the ambient temperature in my heated cab, and there was a faint vibration running through the unit that I could feel even through the mounting bracket. "Eastbound Peterbilt," came another voice, this one so clear it might have been sitting in my passenger seat. "You need to start looking for a place to park. This storm's going to get worse before it gets better, and there's more than weather to worry about on this stretch of road tonight." "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. There are things that move through these badlands when the weather gets bad, things that follow the old wagon trails and railroad grades. They're attracted to the warmth and light of passing vehicles, drawn to the life force of travelers trying to make their way through the darkness. Most folks just see them as tricks of the light, shadows in the snow, but drivers who've been out here long enough know better. The transmission faded into static, but almost immediately another voice took its place, speaking with an urgency that cut through the atmospheric interference. "All drivers on I-94 between Miles City and Billings, be advised that we've got reports of vehicles stopped on the shoulder with no apparent mechanical problems. Occupants appear to be in some kind of trance state, unresponsive to outside contact. Emergency services are en route, but response times are limited due to weather conditions." I had been driving for 15 years and had never heard anything like this on the CB radio. Emergency services communicated through different channels, not the standard trucker frequencies, and the content of these transmissions was unlike anything in my experience. But as I strained to see through the intensifying snowstorm, I began to spot the vehicles the anonymous dispatcher had described. They appeared as dim shapes in the swirling white. Cars and trucks pulled onto the shoulder, with their hazard lights blinking weakly through the snow. As I passed each one, I could see figures sitting motionless behind the wheels, their faces turned upward as if watching something in the sky that I couldn't perceive. None of them responded to the sound of my air horn or the flash of my headlights, and there was something about their absolute stillness that suggested they weren't merely seeking shelter from the storm. My CB radio began cycling through channels rapidly now, the selector spinning like the dial on a radio being tuned by someone searching for a specific frequency. Voices emerged and faded as the channels changed, snippets of conversations that seemed to be happening simultaneously across multiple time periods. I heard discussions about routes that hadn't existed for decades, warnings about road conditions that applied to highways that had been rerouted years ago, and reports of accidents and breakdowns that couldn't possibly be occurring in real time. Channel 19, calling eastbound Peterbilt with the construction equipment, came a voice that seemed to speak directly into my mind rather than through the radio speaker. You need to understand what's happening to you right now. The storm isn't natural, and neither are the voices you're hearing. This stretch of highway passes through what the old-timers called a thin place, where the boundary between different times and realities becomes permeable during certain atmospheric conditions. I wanted to respond, to ask for clarification, but found that my voice wouldn't work. The microphone felt frozen in my hand, too cold to touch, and when I tried to key the transmit button, nothing happened. The radio continued its autonomous operation, scanning channels and adjusting settings according to some internal logic that had nothing to do with my intentions or needs. You're hearing voices from different eras, the transmission continued. Drivers who passed through this area during previous storms, previous decades, their conversations preserved somehow in the electromagnetic signature of the landscape. But there's something else here too, something that feeds on the confusion and disorientation that travelers experience when they encounter phenomena they can't explain. Through my windshield, I began to see shapes moving through the snow that weren't vehicles or natural features of the landscape. Tall, elongated figures that seemed to glide rather than walk, approaching the stopped cars and trucks I'd observed earlier. As they drew closer to each vehicle, the occupants' postures would change subtly, their heads tilting further back, their hands falling away from the steering wheels as if some invisible force were drawing their attention and energy upward into the storm. My speedometer showed that I was maintaining 45 miles per hour, but the landscape outside seemed to be moving past at a much slower rate, as if time itself were being stretched and distorted by whatever forces were at work in this desolate region. The mile markers that had been appearing at regular intervals now seemed impossibly far apart, and according to my GPS, I had been traveling the same 10-mile stretch of highway for over an hour. The CB radio suddenly fell silent, all the phantom transmissions ceasing at once, leaving only the sound of my diesel engine and the wind driving snow against my windshield. But in that silence, I became aware of something far more disturbing than the mysterious voices. My radio was still operating, scanning channels and adjusting volume, but now I could see that the controls were being manipulated by hands that weren't quite human. They were translucent, barely visible against the dark plastic of the radio face, but they moved with definite purpose and intelligence. Long, pale fingers adjusted the squelch control and fine-tuned the frequency, searching for something specific among the electromagnetic spectrum. As I watched in fascination and growing horror, more hands appeared, dozens of them, reaching through the dashboard and radio console to manipulate controls that shouldn't have been accessible from those angles. Finally, came a voice through the speaker, but this time I knew it wasn't being transmitted from another vehicle. The sound was emerging directly from my radio, generated by whatever forces had taken control of the equipment. We've been trying to reach you for such a long time. There are so many of us here, trapped between the signals, caught in the spaces between channels. We need someone to carry our messages, to help us reach the world beyond this storm. I fumbled for the radio's power switch, trying to shut off the unit before whatever was happening could progress any further, but my hands passed through the controls as if they were made of mist. The translucent figures operating my equipment were becoming more solid, more visible, while I seemed to be losing substance, becoming part of the electromagnetic phenomenon that had ensnared so many other travelers. "Don't fight it," advised another voice, this one belonging to what might have been a female trucker from an earlier era. "The transition is easier if you don't resist. You'll still be able to drive, still be able to complete your runs, but you'll also be part of something larger, a network that spans decades and connects drivers across time and space." Through the storm, I could see my destination beginning to appear in the distance, the lights of Billings creating a faint glow against the clouds. But as my truck drew closer to the city, the phantom hands on my radio began working more frantically, and I realized they were trying to establish some kind of permanent connection before I left their domain. The CB crackled with dozens of simultaneous transmissions, voices from different eras all speaking at once, creating a chaos of overlapping conversations that threatened to overwhelm my ability to think clearly. I made a desperate decision and yanked the CB's power cord from its socket, cutting the connection between the radio and my truck's electrical system. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The phantom hands disappeared, the voices cut off in mid-sentence, and the storm began to clear as if it had never existed. Within minutes, I was driving through normal November weather under a star-filled sky, approaching Billings with nothing but the usual interstate traffic around me. But the silence in my cab now feels more ominous than any supernatural transmission. My CB radio remains unplugged, its dark face reflecting the dashboard lights like a dead-eye. Sometimes, late at night, when the highway stretches endlessly ahead and I'm alone with my thoughts and the diesel engine's rhythm, I catch myself reaching for the power cord, wondering what messages might be waiting in that space between channels. The voices are still out there, I'm certain of it, trapped in the electromagnetic signature of that Montana Badlands where reality grows thin during certain weather conditions. They're waiting for another driver to tune in, to become part of their network of communication across time. And the most unsettling part is that sometimes, when I pass other trucks on the highway and glimpse the drivers in their cabs, I wonder if some of them are carrying those phantom passengers. If their radios are being operated by hands that belong to travelers who never quite made it to their final destinations. The highway calls to all of us who drive through the night, but some calls come from places we were never meant to visit, and some conversations are with voices that should have been silenced long ago. My radio stays unplugged, but I can still feel their presence in the static between stations, waiting patiently for the next storm, the next driver, the next opportunity to expand their eternal broadcast across the dark highways of America. The Restless Cargo, from Victor Antonov. The leather suitcase in the back of my Kenworth W900 first moved during a fuel stop outside Flagstaff, Arizona, a subtle shift that I initially attributed to the settling motion of my trailer as I applied the parking brake. It was nearly 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in late September, and the desert air carried the distinctive chill that comes to the high country after sunset, making the fluorescent lights of the truck stop seem harsh and unwelcoming against the vast darkness of the Colorado Plateau. I'd been hauling personal effects and furniture for a family relocating from Phoenix to Denver, the kind of load that required extra care and attention to prevent damage during the long climb through mountain passes and high desert terrain. The suitcase belonged to the Hargrove family, specifically to their deceased grandmother, whose possessions were being transported to a new family home after the sale of her Phoenix residence. Mrs. Hargrove had mentioned during the loading process that her mother-in-law had been a frequent traveler in her younger years, accumulating souvenirs and mementos from destinations across the globe, but had become increasingly reclusive in her final decades, rarely leaving her house except for medical appointments and essential errands. The suitcase was an expensive piece, crafted from rich brown leather with brass fittings that suggested quality craftsmanship from an earlier era, and it felt unusually heavy for its size when the loading crew had placed it in my trailer alongside boxes of books, photographs, and other personal items. During the fuel stop, I had walked back to check the load securement, a routine practice that had saved me from costly damage claims over the years. Everything appeared normal at first glance. The furniture was still properly padded and strapped, the boxes remained in their original positions, and the cargo bars were secure in their mounting points. But as I played my flashlight across the contents of the trailer, I noticed that the leather suitcase had shifted several feet from where it had been loaded, moving from its original position near the front of the trailer to a spot approximately halfway back, despite being surrounded by other items that hadn't moved at all. I assumed that someone had rearranged the load during the last stop without mentioning it to me. perhaps repositioning items to better distribute weight or improve accessibility. Loading crews sometimes made adjustments during brief stops, and it wouldn't have been the first time such changes had occurred without proper communication. I made a note in my logbook about the shifted cargo, but didn't consider it significant enough to warrant further investigation, focused instead on maintaining my schedule and reaching Denver within the contracted time frame. But as I continued the drive through the Arizona high country, climbing steadily toward the Four Corners region, where Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah meet in one of the most remote and sparsely populated areas of the American West, I became increasingly aware of sounds coming from the trailer that didn't match the normal rhythm of cargo shifting during turns and grade changes. Instead of the predictable creaking and settling noises that accompany any loaded trailer, I heard what sounded like deliberate movement, as if something in the back was repositioning itself according to its own agenda, rather than responding to the forces of physics and momentum. The first clear evidence of something unusual came during a rest break at a scenic overlook near Shiprock, New Mexico, where I had stopped to stretch my legs and check my route through the mountain passes ahead. The parking area was empty except for my truck, and the silence of the high desert was broken only by the distant whistle of wind through rock formations and the tick of cooling metal from my engine. As I walked around to the back of my trailer to perform another cargo check, I could hear distinct sounds of movement coming from inside. Not the random shifting of loose items, but the purposeful rustling and scraping that suggested something was actively exploring its confined environment. When I opened the trailer doors, my flashlight beam immediately found the leather suitcase in yet another new location, this time positioned near the trailer doors as if it had worked its way toward the exit during the 3 hours since my last inspection. More disturbing was the evidence around the suitcase itself. Other items had been pushed aside to create a clear pathway. Boxes rearranged and furniture shifted in ways that suggested the movement had been systematic and goal-oriented rather than the result of natural forces acting on the cargo during transit. I examined the suitcase more closely, noting details I had overlooked during the initial loading process. The leather surface was unmarked by the kind of wear and scuffing that typically results from being moved around a cargo area, and the brass fittings were polished to a brightness that seemed inconsistent with an item that had been jostling around inside a moving trailer for hundreds of miles. More peculiar was the temperature of the case itself, which felt distinctly warm to the touch despite the cool air inside the unheated trailer, as if some internal source of heat were operating within the confines of the luggage. As I stood there in the darkness, trying to rationalize what I was observing, the suitcase moved again, a definite shift of several inches that occurred while I was watching directly. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, accompanied by a soft scraping sound as the leather bottom slid across the aluminum trailer floor. I stepped backward involuntarily, my flashlight beam wavering as my hands began to shake, and in that moment of distraction, I could have sworn I heard something that sounded like muffled voices coming from inside the case, speaking in languages I didn't recognize, but with cadences and inflections that suggested conversation or perhaps argument. My first instinct was to call the Hargrove family and report the unusual behavior of their grandmother's luggage, but at 3:30 in the morning in the middle of the New Mexico high desert, cell phone coverage was non-existent and the nearest town was over an hour away. I was faced with the choice of either abandoning my schedule to seek help or continuing the journey and hoping that whatever was causing the suitcase to behave so strangely would resolve itself before I reached Denver. Professional pride and contractual obligations won out over growing unease, and I decided to secure the suitcase more firmly and continue the drive. I used additional cargo straps to anchor the case to the trailer wall, creating a web of restraints that should have prevented any further movement, regardless of the forces acting upon it. The leather felt even warmer as I worked, and I noticed that the brass locks and fittings were beginning to show a faint luminescence, as if they were absorbing and reflecting light from my flashlight in ways that defied normal optical properties. The drive through Colorado proved to be the longest night of my trucking career. Every few miles I could hear new sounds coming from the trailer. Not just the movement of the suitcase, but what sounded like other items being manipulated, rearranged, and repositioned by unseen hands. The cargo straps I had installed to secure the mysterious luggage were apparently having no effect, as evidenced by the continued scraping and sliding noises that punctuated the otherwise peaceful hours of mountain driving. Around dawn, as I descended from the Rockies toward the Denver metropolitan area, the sounds from the trailer changed character entirely. Instead of the mechanical noises of objects being moved around, I began to hear what sounded unmistakably like human voices, dozens of them speaking simultaneously in a cacophony of languages and dialects that created a low murmur of conversation, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter, argument, or what might have been singing. The voices rose and fell in volume, sometimes barely audible above the road noise, and sometimes loud enough to be clearly distinguishable even over the rumble of my diesel engine. I pulled into a rest area just outside of Denver, desperate to confront whatever was happening in my trailer before completing the delivery. The morning sun was casting long shadows across the parking area, and the presence of other vehicles and people provided a sense of security that had been absent during the isolated hours of mountain driving. But when I opened the trailer doors, I discovered a scene that defied rational explanation. The entire load had been rearranged, not randomly, but with obvious intelligence and purpose. Furniture had been repositioned to create clear pathways through the trailer. Boxes were stacked in neat pyramids that hadn't existed when I loaded them, and personal items had been sorted and organized according to some system that I couldn't immediately understand. At the center of this reorganized cargo sat the leather suitcase, no longer restrained by the straps I had installed, but somehow elevated on a platform created from books and smaller boxes, as if it had been placed on a makeshift altar. As I stood in the trailer doorway, trying to process what I was seeing, the suitcase opened by itself. The brass locks clicked in sequence, and the lid lifted to reveal an interior that was far larger than the exterior dimensions should have allowed. Instead of the clothing and personal items I expected to find, the case appeared to contain a swirling mass of what looked like fog or mist, illuminated by a soft light that had no apparent source. Within that ethereal substance, I could see shapes moving, human figures that appeared and disappeared like actors on a stage where the lighting was constantly changing. The voices I had been hearing during the drive were coming from these figures, conversations in languages that spanned decades or perhaps centuries, discussions of places and events that seemed to cover a vast range of historical periods. As I listened more carefully, I began to distinguish individual conversations from the general murmur, stories being shared among travelers who had apparently been brought together within the confines of this impossible luggage. One voice, speaking in English with the precise diction of an earlier era, seemed to be addressing me directly. "Driver, we apologize for the disturbance during your journey. We don't mean to cause problems, but confinement in this case becomes quite uncomfortable when we're all trying to exist in the same limited space. The movement you've observed is our attempt to create more room for everyone." Another voice joined the conversation, this one belonging to someone who sounded much younger and spoke with a slight accent that might have been German or Austrian. The grandmother who owned this case was quite a traveler in her youth, you know. Every destination she visited, every hotel she stayed in, every journey she completed left traces in the leather and brass. Were the accumulated experiences of a lifetime of travel, the memories and encounters that became embedded in her luggage through decades of use. I wanted to run, to flee from this impossible situation and never look back, but I found myself drawn into the conversation despite every instinct that told me to leave immediately. "Are you trapped in there?" I asked, feeling somewhat foolish for engaging in dialogue with voices emerging from a piece of luggage. "Not trapped, exactly," replied the first voice. "More like preserved. Each journey, each destination, each person she encountered during her travels became part of the case's history. When she died, that accumulated experience didn't disappear, but remained active, continuing to exist within the physical object that had contained and transported it for so many years. As we talked, more figures became visible within the swirling mist, and I realized I was looking at a vast collection of travelers from different eras and cultures, all somehow connected through their association with the grandmother's luggage. There were business travelers from the 1950s, backpackers from the 1970s, families on vacation from various decades, and individuals whose clothing and manners suggested they had lived in eras spanning back to the early 20th century or beyond. "What happens now?" I asked. "The family is expecting delivery of their grandmother's belongings today." "The delivery will proceed as planned," assured the younger voice. "But the case will continue to collect experiences, to absorb the memories and encounters of whoever possesses it. That's what it was created to do, what it has been doing for decades. The family will receive their inheritance, but they'll also be receiving something far more complex than they realize." As the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, the voices began to fade, and the figures within the mist became less distinct. The suitcase closed by itself, the brass locks clicking into place with the finality of a door being shut on a roomful of secrets. The reorganized cargo remained in its new configuration, but the case itself had returned to its normal appearance, showing no trace of the supernatural activity I had witnessed during the hours of darkness. I completed the delivery to the Hargrove family's new home in Denver without mentioning the unusual behavior of the grandmother's luggage. Mrs. Hargrove thanked me for the careful handling of their possessions and made particular note of how well the furniture and fragile items had survived the journey. She mentioned that they planned to go through the grandmother's suitcase later that week to sort through what she assumed would be old clothes and travel souvenirs from her mother-in-law's younger days. I often wonder what they found when they finally opened that case, whether the accumulated experiences and preserved memories revealed themselves to the family or remained hidden until someone else began to travel with the luggage. The voices I heard during that long night through the Colorado mountains were real. I'm certain of that, just as I'm certain that some objects absorb more than just physical wear from the lives they touch. The highway continues to call to drivers like me, carrying cargo that ranges from the mundane to the mysterious, but I've learned to listen more carefully to the sounds coming from my trailer, and I pay closer attention to items that seem to move on their own. Some possessions carry the weight of far more than their physical dimensions suggest, and some deliveries involve transporting passengers who never truly finish their journeys, even after their owners have long since reached their final destinations. The Endless Parade by Maria Santos. The first faceless hitchhiker appeared in my headlights somewhere along Highway 50 through the Nevada desert, that infamous stretch of asphalt they call the loneliest road in America, where the distance between towns can swallow a driver's sense of time and space like quicksand consuming a wayward traveler. It was just past midnight on a moonless August evening, and my Freightliner Columbia was hauling computer components from San Francisco to Salt Lake City. The kind of time-tensive cargo that kept me running through the night while most of the world slept peacefully in air-conditioned bedrooms, far from the scorching heat that lingered in the desert air even after sunset. The figure stood beside the road approximately 50 yards ahead, positioned in that universal stance of someone seeking a ride, with one arm extended toward the passing traffic and the other hanging loosely at their side. From a distance, it appeared to be a perfectly normal person, wearing jeans and what looked like a light-colored shirt, but as my headlights drew closer and illuminated more detail, I realized that something was fundamentally wrong with what I was seeing. Where the hitchhiker's face should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin, as if someone had taken an eraser to a photograph and carefully removed every trace of eyes, nose, and mouth. My first instinct was to dismiss what I was seeing as a trick of the headlights and distance, perhaps a mannequin that someone had placed beside the road as a prank or art installation. The desert has always attracted eccentric individuals who express their creativity in ways that seem bizarre to more conventional minds. and Highway 50 had seen its share of unusual displays over the years. But as I drew closer, the figure turned its blank face toward my approaching truck, tracking my movement with the fluid motion of something alive and aware. I downshifted and slowed, not out of any intention to stop, but from the natural curiosity that comes when confronted with something that doesn't fit normal patterns of experience. The hitchhiker remained motionless as I passed, its faceless head following the progress of my truck and trailer, like a sunflower following the arc of the sun across the sky. In my side mirrors, I could see the figure still standing there long after it should have disappeared into the darkness, a pale shape beside the road that seemed to glow with its own internal light. 5 miles further down the highway, I encountered the second one. This figure was positioned on the opposite side of the road, also hitchhiking, but facing the opposite direction, as if seeking transportation back toward the area I had just passed through. Like the first, it appeared human in every respect except for the complete absence of facial features, and like the first, it turned to watch my truck as I approached and passed, its smooth head rotating with mechanical precision to track my movement. The third hitchhiker appeared another 3 miles down the road, then a fourth, then a fifth, until I realized that the entire stretch of Highway 50 ahead of me was lined with these faceless figures, spaced at irregular intervals like ghostly sentinels guarding the passage through the Nevada desert. They varied in apparent size and build, some tall and thin, others shorter and more solid, some wearing clothing that suggested different eras and styles, but all shared that same horrifying absence of human features where their faces should have been. My CB radio had been silent for hours, unusual for a major trucking route, but not unprecedented in this remote region where radio signals struggled to penetrate the vast emptiness between populated areas. I tried raising other drivers on Channel 19, hoping to hear from someone else who might be traveling the same stretch of highway, but received only static in response. Even the emergency channels were dead, as if some force were interfering with radio communications throughout the area. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank, enough to reach my planned stop in Ely without concern, but as the parade of faceless hitchhikers continued, I began to worry about more than just fuel consumption. The figures were becoming more numerous, appearing every half mile or less, and their behavior was evolving from passive observation to what seemed like active interest in my truck. Some had begun to step closer to the road as I approached, moving from the shoulder onto the asphalt itself, forcing me to adjust my lane position to avoid them. Around mile marker 127, approximately an hour into this surreal gauntlet of faceless observers, I noticed that some of the hitchhikers were no longer content to simply watch my progress. Instead, they had begun following my truck, walking along the roadside at a pace that somehow allowed them to keep up with my 45-mile-per-hour speed through the desert night. In my mirrors, I could see a growing procession of figures trailing behind my trailer, their forms barely visible in the red glow of my taillights, but definitely there, maintaining a steady pursuit that defied normal human limitations. The temperature gauge showed normal readings, and all my other instruments indicated that the truck was operating within acceptable parameters, but I could feel something changing in the way the engine responded to acceleration. When I pressed the accelerator pedal to increase speed and put distance between myself and the growing crowd of followers, the engine seemed to labor more than it should, as if the truck were pulling a much heavier load than the computer components listed on my bill of lading. That's when I realized that some of the hitchhikers had begun climbing onto my trailer. I couldn't see them directly, but I could feel the additional weight affecting my truck's performance, and I could hear sounds coming from the trailer that weren't consistent with normal road noise or cargo shifting. Soft footsteps, scraping sounds as if multiple bodies were moving across the aluminum surface, and occasionally what sounded like tapping or scratching, as if fingernails were being drawn across the metal skin of the trailer. I tried to radio for help again, switching between channels and adjusting the antenna, but the static had been replaced by something even more disturbing. Instead of empty white noise, the radio now carried faint sounds that might have been voices, speaking in whispers too quiet to understand, but with cadences that suggested conversation or perhaps chanting. The voices seemed to come from multiple sources, creating a layered chorus that rose and fell in volume like waves breaking against a distant shore. The hitchhikers lining the roadside were now standing closer together, creating an almost continuous wall of faceless figures stretching ahead into the darkness beyond my headlights. Some had begun to extend both arms toward my truck, not in the traditional hitchhiking gesture, but in what looked more like an embrace, or perhaps an attempt to physically stop my progress. The temperature inside my cab had begun to drop, despite the desert heat outside, and frost was forming on the interior surfaces of my windows, creating patterns that resembled faces or symbols in some unknown language. Around mile marker 140, I encountered something that made me consider abandoning my truck and seeking help on foot, despite the obvious dangers of walking through the desert at night. The road ahead was completely blocked by faceless hitchhikers, hundreds of them standing shoulder to shoulder across both lanes of the highway in a formation that stretched from one side of the asphalt to the other. They stood perfectly still, their blank faces turned toward my approaching headlights, waiting with the patience of something that had existed long before human civilization and would continue to exist long after the last truck had traveled its final mile. I had no choice but to slow to a crawl and attempt to navigate through the crowd, hoping that they would part before my truck like a sea of flesh and fabric. As I approached, the figures did indeed begin to move, but not in the way I had hoped. Instead of stepping aside to allow passage, they began to press closer to my truck, their hands reaching up to touch the hood, the mirrors, the door handles, leaving no visible marks, but creating a sensation of contact that I could feel even through the metal and glass barriers of my cab. The whispers from my CB radio had grown louder, and I could now distinguish individual words and phrases in languages I didn't recognize. Some sounded like pleas or requests, others like warnings or threats, all delivered in voices that had the hollow, echoing quality of sound traveling through vast empty spaces. As the faceless crowd surrounded my truck, the whispers began to synchronize, creating a unified chant that seemed to resonate through the vehicle's frame and into my bone. I realized that the hitchhikers weren't trying to stop me or cause harm in any conventional sense. Instead, they were attempting to communicate something, to convey information or instructions that required my participation to complete. The faceless condition wasn't a deformity or curse, but a state of incompleteness, as if they were unfinished beings waiting for someone to provide the missing elements of their existence. Through the windshield, I could see that one of the figures had climbed onto my hood and was pressing what should have been its face against the glass. The smooth, featureless surface made contact with the windshield, and suddenly I could see through its eyes, or rather through the absence where its eyes should have been. The vision that flooded my consciousness showed Highway 50 as it had appeared decades earlier, populated with different vehicles and different travelers, all of whom had encountered the same faceless parade and made the same choice that now confronted me. The choice was simple, but irreversible. I could continue driving, fighting against the growing weight of the hitchhikers who had attached themselves to my truck, and eventually reach a point where the engine could no longer function under the supernatural load. Or I could stop, turn off the engine, and step out of my cab to join the endless procession of travelers who had become part of whatever phenomenon had claimed this stretch of desert highway. But as I considered these options, a third possibility occurred to me. The faceless hitchhikers were incomplete beings, lacking the features that would allow them to fully exist in the world of the living. But they weren't malicious entities seeking to harm passing motorists. They were lost souls seeking completion, trying to borrow the life force and experiences of the living to fill the voids where their identities should have resided. I began to speak aloud, not into the CB microphone, but directly to the figures surrounding my truck, sharing stories of my own travels, descriptions of the places I had seen and the people I had met during my years as a long-haul driver. I told them about sunrise over the Rocky Mountains, about the way cities looked from interstate overpasses at night, about the camaraderie among truckers, and the satisfaction of delivering cargo safely to its destination. As I spoke, the weight pressing down on my truck began to lessen. The figures on my hood and trailer started to become more translucent, and those lining the roadside began to step back from the asphalt. The whispers from my radio gradually faded, replaced by the normal static of empty channels, and the frost on my windows began to melt in the warming air of my cab. By the time I reached mile marker 150, the last of the faceless hitchhikers had disappeared from view, leaving Highway 50 empty and normal looking under the star-filled desert sky. My truck was running smoothly again, all instruments showing normal readings, and when I tried my CB radio, I immediately picked up conversations from other drivers traveling various routes across the western states. I completed my delivery to Salt Lake City without further incident, though I found myself thinking constantly about the encounter with the faceless parade. The computer components I had been hauling were all accounted for, showing no signs of damage or interference, but something about the cargo seemed different. When the receiving dock workers opened the trailer doors, they commented on how perfectly organized everything was, how the shipping cartons seemed to have arranged themselves for optimal unloading efficiency. Now, months later, I still travel Highway 50 when my routes take me through Nevada, but I've learned to watch for signs that the faceless hitchhikers might be gathering again. Sometimes, on nights when the air is particularly still and the stars seem brighter than usual, I catch glimpses of figures in my peripheral vision, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights. They're not hitchhiking anymore, not reaching out with extended thumbs or blocking the roadway. Instead, they simply watch as I pass, and in their blank faces I can sometimes detect the faint outlines of features, as if the stories I shared that night are slowly helping them remember who they used to be. The desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes it also keeps the lost and forgotten, providing them with opportunities to interact with the world of the living in ways that might eventually lead them back to whatever existence they left behind. The faceless hitchhikers are still out there, I'm certain of it, but they're no longer quite as desperate, no longer quite as incomplete. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through empty country with only the stars for company, I find myself telling stories to the darkness, sharing experiences and memories with listeners I cannot see but somehow know are there, grateful for the contact with a world they can no longer fully inhabit but refuse to completely abandon. The all-knowing night shift. From Kevin Walsh. The night clerk at the Flying J outside Amarillo knew my name before I'd even pulled out my wallet, greeting me with a familiarity that sent an immediate chill through the fluorescent-lit convenience store despite the sweltering Texas heat that lingered well past midnight in late July. I'd been driving my International ProStar for 11 hours straight, hauling steel pipes from Houston to Denver, and this was my first stop at this particular truck stop during the 3 years I had been running this route. Yet when I approached the counter to pay for fuel, the thin man behind the register looked up from his paperwork with a smile that suggested we were old acquaintances meeting after a long absence. "Evening, Kevin," he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had spent decades working night shifts in places where time moved differently than it did in the daylight world. "Quite a load you're carrying tonight. Steel pipes, grade A53, 40-foot lengths. Picked them up from Hartwell Industries on the east side of Houston around 11 this morning, I'd imagine." I stared at him, trying to process how a stranger could know such specific details about my cargo and schedule. His appearance was unremarkable enough. Mid-50s, graying hair, wire-rimmed glasses, wearing the standard uniform polo shirt that truck stop employees had worn for decades. But his eyes held an intensity that seemed disproportionate to our casual transaction, studying my face with a kind of attention that suggested he was reading information written in languages I couldn't understand. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" I asked, setting my credit card on the counter but not yet sliding it through the payment terminal. "Not directly," he replied, pulling up my fuel transaction on his computer screen with movements that were too quick and precise, as if he had been expecting this exact interaction. "But I know about the accident you had 3 years ago outside Lubbock. Single vehicle collision, rolled your truck trying to avoid a deer that ran into the highway. Spent 2 weeks in the hospital with a concussion and 3 broken ribs. Still get headaches when the barometric pressure drops, don't you? The specific accuracy of his knowledge hit me like a physical blow. The accident he described had never been officially reported beyond the insurance company and the state patrol, and certainly wasn't the kind of information that would be accessible to a random truck stop clerk in the middle of the Texas Panhandle. More disturbing was his mention of the headaches, a persistent problem that I had never discussed with anyone except my doctor and my wife, a detail so personal and private that hearing it spoken aloud by a stranger made my hands begin to shake. "How could you possibly know that?" I demanded, my voice rising above the comfortable volume appropriate for late-night conversation. "Who are you?" "I'm just the night clerk," he said, his smile never wavering as he processed my credit card payment with efficiency that suggested he had handled thousands of similar transactions. "But working nights gives you access to different kinds of information, Kevin. People reveal things in the darkness that they keep hidden during daylight hours. Secrets have a way of traveling through the night air, collecting in places like this, where travelers stop to rest and refuel." As he spoke, I became aware that we were not alone in the store. Other customers moved through the aisles behind me, but when I turned to look at them, they seemed strangely insubstantial, like figures glimpsed through heavy fog or smoke. Their movements were too smooth, too coordinated, and none of them made any sound as they walked across the tile floor or handled merchandise from the shelves. They appeared to be shopping, examining products and making selections. But I never saw any of them approach the counter to make purchases. "Your receipt," the clerk said, handing me a slip of paper that felt unusually warm to the touch. "You should probably get some rest before continuing your journey. The route through New Mexico can be challenging when you're carrying the kind of guilt that's been weighing on you for the past 18 months. I looked down at the receipt, expecting to see the standard fuel purchase information, but the paper contained far more than transaction details. Listed beneath the date and fuel amount were entries that read like a psychological profile: unresolved grief over father's death, anxiety about financial security, marital problems stemming from extended time on the road, and, most disturbing of all, knowledge of hit-and-run incident never reported to authorities. The last entry made my blood run cold. 18 months earlier, while driving through a construction zone outside Oklahoma City, I had clipped a construction worker with my side mirror, sending him tumbling into a concrete barrier. I had stopped, seen that he was conscious and apparently uninjured, and after a brief conversation in which he assured me he was fine and didn't need medical attention, I had continued on my route without filing an official report. The incident had haunted me ever since, a constant source of anxiety and guilt that I had shared with no one, not even my wife. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," I said, crushing the receipt in my fist, "but this stops now. I'm reporting this to your manager and the corporate office." "There's no manager here at night," the clerk replied calmly, adjusting his glasses with a gesture that seemed oddly formal. "And corporate offices don't handle matters that involve the kind of information I specialize in collecting. But if it makes you feel better, you're welcome to call whoever you'd like. The phone booth outside still works, though most people prefer to use their cell phones these days." I stormed out of the store, intending to return to my truck and leave this bizarre encounter behind. But as I walked across the parking lot, I noticed details that I had missed during my initial arrival. The other trucks parked at the fuel islands weren't running, despite the summer heat that made sleeping without air conditioning nearly impossible for most drivers. More strange was the fact that none of them showed any signs of recent operation. No heat shimmer from cooling engines, no sound of auxiliary power units or idling diesels, no drivers visible in the cabs or moving around their vehicles. My own truck sat exactly where I had left it, but something about its appearance seemed different, as if someone had been examining it closely during the few minutes I had spent inside the store. The fuel cap was properly secured, the trailer doors were still locked, and all the external equipment appeared untouched. but there was an overall sense that my rig had been the subject of detailed scrutiny by unseen observers. I climbed into my cab and started the engine, eager to put distance between myself and the unsettling truck stop. But as I prepared to pull away from the fuel island, the clerk appeared at my driver's side window. He had moved from inside the store to the parking lot with impossible speed, covering a distance that should have taken at least a minute in what seemed like seconds. "Evan," he said, tapping gently on the glass, "you forgot something inside." Against my better judgment, I rolled down the window. "I didn't forget anything. I want to get out of here." "The construction worker you hit in Oklahoma City," he continued as if I hadn't spoken. "His name was Miguel Santos. He has a wife and 3 children, and the back injury he sustained in your accident has prevented him from working for the past 6 months. His family is facing foreclosure on their home because they can't make the mortgage payments without his income." The specific details he provided were like physical blows, each one more painful than the last. I had tried to forget about the incident, to convince myself that the worker had truly been uninjured and that no lasting harm had been done. But hearing his name, learning about his family, and the ongoing consequences of our brief collision made it impossible to maintain the fiction I had constructed to protect myself from guilt and responsibility. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing you're not already prepared to give," he replied. "The guilt has been eating at you for 18 months, Kevin. It's affecting your sleep, your relationship with your wife, your ability to focus on the road. You know what needs to be done to make this right, but you've been too afraid of the consequences to take action." As he spoke, I became aware that the other figures I had seen inside the store were now gathered around my truck, standing silently in the harsh glow of the fuel island lighting. Up close, I could see that they weren't entirely human, or perhaps they were human but somehow altered, their features slightly out of focus, their movements too fluid and coordinated to be natural. They watched our conversation with the patient attention of an audience at a play, waiting for the dramatic conclusion they knew was inevitable. "These are other travelers who have stopped here over the years," the clerk explained, following my gaze to the assembled figures. "Drivers and passengers who carried secrets that were too heavy to bear alone. They found relief here, absolution through confession and appropriate action. Most of them were able to continue their journeys with lighter consciences and clearer minds." "And the others?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "The others chose to remain burdened by their secrets, to carry their guilt and shame until it consumed them entirely. They're still traveling the highways, but they're not truly alive anymore, just going through the motions of existence without ever finding peace or resolution." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to me through the open window. The card was blank except for a phone number and the words, "Miguel Santos, 4055557823. "The choice is yours, Kevin," he said, stepping back from my truck. "You can drive away and continue carrying this burden for the rest of your life, or you can make the call that will start the process of making things right. But understand that this is the only time you'll receive this opportunity. The night shift doesn't offer second chances." I sat in my idling truck, holding the business card, and staring at the phone number that could connect me with the man whose life I had disrupted 18 months earlier. Around me, the assembled figures continued their silent vigil, neither encouraging nor discouraging my decision, but simply witnessing whatever choice I would make. The rational part of my mind insisted that this entire encounter was impossible, that truck stop clerks don't possess supernatural knowledge about their customers' deepest secrets, and that groups of otherworldly beings don't gather to observe moral dilemmas in parking lots beside interstate highways. But the weight of guilt I had been carrying for so long was real, as was the relief I felt at finally having someone acknowledge the burden I had been bearing alone. I took out my cell phone and dialed the number on the card. It rang 3 times before a man's voice answered. cautious and slightly suspicious, as people tend to be when receiving calls from unknown numbers late at night. "Hello, is this Miguel Santos?" I said, my voice shaking with nervousness and anticipation. "Yes, who is this?" "My name's Kevin Walsh. I'm a truck driver, and 18 months ago I was involved in an accident with you at a construction site outside Oklahoma City. I need to talk to you about what happened and about making things right." The conversation that followed was difficult, painful, and ultimately cathartic. Miguel Santos was a gracious and forgiving man who had indeed been struggling with back problems since our collision, but who was more concerned with understanding what had happened than with assigning blame or demanding retribution. We talked for nearly an hour, and by the end of our conversation we had arranged to meet the following week to discuss appropriate compensation for his medical expenses and lost wages. When I finally ended the call and looked around the parking lot, the assembled figures had disappeared and the truck stop had returned to normal operation. Other drivers were fueling their rigs, the store windows showed typical late-night activity, and the clerk I had encountered was nowhere to be seen. A different person entirely was working behind the counter, a young woman who greeted me with standard customer service politeness when I went back inside to purchase coffee for the road. I completed my delivery to Denver without incident. But the experience at the Flying J had changed something fundamental about how I approached my work and my life. The phone conversation with Miguel Santos led to a meeting that resulted in financial support for his family and a friendship that continues to this day. More importantly, it taught me that some burdens become lighter when they're shared, and that confession and appropriate action can provide relief that no amount of rationalization or denial can match. I still pass by that truck stop occasionally when my routes take me through the Texas Panhandle. But I've never again encountered the night clerk, who seemed to know my deepest secrets. Sometimes I wonder if he's still there, working the graveyard shift and helping other travelers confront the burdens they carry, offering opportunities for redemption to drivers who are ready to face the consequences of their actions. The highway holds many mysteries, and some of the most profound encounters happen at truck stops and rest areas where the night shift operates according to different rules than those that govern daylight hours. There are people working in these places who seem to have access to information that transcends normal human knowledge, and sometimes the most frightening thing they can offer is not punishment or judgment, but the chance to finally make things right. The voices from the roadside. From Patricia Coleman. The first memorial began whispering to me, somewhere along Interstate 75, through the Kentucky mountains, its weathered white cross catching my headlights like a beacon in the darkness, as my Volvo V&L climbed steadily through the Cumberland Gap on a fog-shrouded Tuesday night in early October. I'd been hauling automotive parts from Detroit to Atlanta, a routine run that I'd made dozens of times over my 8-year trucking career. But this particular journey felt different from the moment I'd departed Michigan, as if the familiar highway was leading me towards something that had been waiting patiently for my arrival. The memorial stood about 50 yards off the shoulder, positioned on a small rise that gave it prominence over the surrounding landscape of dense forest and rocky outcropping. Plastic flowers in faded colors surrounded the base of the cross, and a small American flag fluttered in the mountain breeze. They carried the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke from chimneys in distant valleys. As my headlight beam swept across the display during a curve in the highway, I could have sworn I heard something that sounded like a voice calling my name. Though the sound was so faint, it might have been nothing more than wind through the trees, or the distant whistle of a train echoing through the hollows. I dismissed the experience as a product of fatigue and the kind of heightened awareness that comes with driving through mountain terrain in conditions of limited visibility. The fog had been thickening for the past hour, reducing my speed to 45 miles per hour and making every mile marker and roadside feature appear ghost-like in the mist. Roadside memorials were common along the stretch of highway, marking locations where accidents had claimed lives over the decades, and I had always found them sobering reminders of the dangers that accompanied life on the road. But 10 miles further south, I encountered another memorial, this one consisting of 3 crosses, arranged in a triangular pattern beside a sharp curve that had claimed an entire family in a single tragedy. Fresh flowers suggested that someone still visited regularly to maintain the display, and a laminated photograph showed a young couple with their infant daughter, all smiling at the camera with the kind of happiness that made their loss feel even more profound. As I navigated the curve, reducing speed to accommodate the reduced visibility, I heard it again. Not just one voice this time, but multiple voices, speaking in whispers so soft they seemed to emerge from inside my own head rather than from any external source. "Patricia," they said, the sound carrying clearly over the rumble of my diesel engine and the hum of road noise. "Patricia, slow down. Be careful through this section. We know what can happen here when drivers aren't paying attention." I checked my speedometer, which showed 38 miles per hour, well below the posted speed limit and appropriate for the current conditions. My following distance was adequate, my headlights were properly adjusted, and all my vehicle systems were operating normally. Yet the whispered warning carried such urgency and specificity that I found myself reducing speed even further, creeping through the mountain curves at barely 30 miles per hour, while my hazard lights flashed to warn any traffic I might approach from behind. The fog continued to thicken as I descended toward the valley floor, and with each roadside memorial I passed, the whispers became more distinct, more personal, as if the voices were learning how to communicate more effectively with each interaction. A single cross marking the location where a motorcycle rider had lost control now spoke with the accent and inflection of a young man, warning about a pothole that had opened recently in the right lane about a mile ahead. Twin crosses, commemorating two teenagers who had died in a racing accident, provided detailed information about changing weather patterns that would affect visibility around the next series of curves. By the time I reached the valley floor and began the climb up the opposite side of the mountains, I was no longer questioning whether the voices were real. Instead, I found myself looking forward to each memorial, anticipating the warnings and advice they would offer about the road conditions ahead. The whispered voices had become my personal traffic report, providing information that was more current and specific than anything available through official channels or CB radio communications. "Patricia," came a new voice as I approached an elaborate memorial consisting of a stone bench surrounded by carefully maintained landscaping. "There's a deer crossing area just ahead. A family group has been using this spot regularly for the past few weeks, always around this time of night. They come down from the ridge to drink at the creek that runs under the bridge about half a mile ahead." I slowed even further, scanning the roadside vegetation for any sign of movement, and sure enough, within minutes I spotted the gleam of reflective eyes in the darkness beyond my headlights. A doe and two fawns stood at the edge of the asphalt, clearly preparing to cross the highway, and without the warning from the memorial's voice, I might have encountered them at normal highway speed, with potentially tragic results for both the deer and myself. As I crept past the animals, giving them time to cross safely to the other side, I called out a thank you toward the memorial I had just passed, though I wasn't sure if the voices could hear my response, or if they were simply one-way communications from whatever remained of the souls who had died at these locations. But immediately, as if in response to my gratitude, I heard a sound that might have been laughter, warm and pleased, carried on the mountain air like an echo of happiness from better times. The pattern continued throughout my journey through the Kentucky mountains. Each memorial offered specific, helpful information about the highway ahead. Warnings about ice forming on bridge surfaces before the temperature gauge in my truck detected the changing conditions. Alerts about construction vehicles that had been left in travel lanes after hours. Advisories about flash flooding in low-lying areas where recent rain had been heavier than official weather reports indicated. The voices were unfailingly accurate, their information proving valuable time and again as I navigated conditions that would have been far more challenging without their guidance. But as I descended the southern slopes of the Cumberland Mountains and approached the Tennessee border, the tone of the whispers began to change. Instead of helpful warnings about immediate road conditions, The voices started sharing more personal information, details about my life and circumstances that they shouldn't have been able to know. "Patricia," said a voice from a memorial dedicated to a truck driver who had died in a rollover accident, "you've been thinking about leaving this profession, haven't you? The loneliness, the time away from home, the physical toll of long hours behind the wheel. You've been considering that office job your sister offered you in Cincinnati." The accuracy of this observation was unsettling. I had indeed been questioning my career choice, weighing the benefits of steady trucking income against the costs to my personal relationships and physical health. My sister's offer of administrative work at her accounting firm was something I had been considering seriously, though I had discussed it with no one except my closest friend, and certainly not while driving alone through the Kentucky mountains. "The road has been good to you," continued another voice, this one emerging from a simple wooden cross marked with the name Billy Ray and a date from 15 years earlier. "But it's also taken things from you. The marriage that ended because you were never home, the friendships that faded because your schedule never allowed for regular contact, the family gatherings you missed because you were always somewhere between one city and another." Again, the personal details were accurate to the point of being disturbing. My divorce 3 years earlier had indeed been largely attributed to the demands of my trucking career, and I had missed numerous important family events due to scheduling conflicts and delivery deadlines. These were private struggles that I had shared with very few people, certainly not in any context where roadside memorial voices could have learned about them. As I crossed into Tennessee and began the long descent toward Nashville, the whispers became more insistent, more urgent, as if time were running out for whatever message they were trying to convey. Multiple voices now spoke simultaneously, creating a chorus of advice and warnings that went far beyond simple traffic information. "There's going to be an accident ahead," they said in unison, their collective voice carrying a weight of certainty that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. "Not immediately, not tonight, but soon. Within the next month, on a run between Chicago and Miami during a rainstorm, when visibility is poor and other drivers are pushing too hard to make up time." The specificity of this prediction was both frightening and oddly comforting. If the voices were accurate about future events as they had been about current road conditions, then advance warning might allow me to avoid whatever danger they were predicting. But the implications went deeper than simple accident avoidance. They suggested that the voices could see across time as well as space, that their perspective on events was not limited to the present moment. "The choice is yours," continued the chorus of whispers, "but understand that every decision has consequences, and some roads lead to destinations you never intended to reach. The office job in Cincinnati offers safety and stability, but it also means abandoning a profession that has been part of your identity for nearly a decade. Staying on the road means continuing to face the risks we've all experienced, but it also means remaining connected to something larger than yourself." As I approached the outskirts of Nashville, where the concentration of roadside memorials increased dramatically due to higher traffic density and more complex intersection patterns, the whispers began to fade. One by one, the voices that guided me through the mountains fell silent, until only a single speaker remained, the voice of what sounded like an elderly woman whose memorial I had passed hours earlier near the Kentucky-Tennessee border. "Patricia," she said, her voice growing fainter with each word, "remember that we're not trying to frighten you or force you into any particular decision. We're simply sharing what we've learned from our own experiences, hoping that our knowledge might help other travelers make more informed choices about their journeys." "But why me?" I asked aloud, speaking to the empty cab, but directing my question toward whatever presence had been communicating with me throughout the night. "Why are the memorials talking to me specifically?" "Because you're listening," came the response, so quiet it was barely distinguishable from the road noise and engine sound. "Most drivers pass by without hearing us, too focused on their destinations to notice the voices of those who never completed their final trips. But you've always been sensitive to things that others miss, aware of subtleties and details that escape normal attention. That sensitivity is what allows us to reach you, and it's also what makes you a safer driver than most. The voice faded completely as I entered the Nashville metropolitan area, where the urban lighting and increased traffic created an environment too busy and complicated for the quiet whispers from roadside memorials. But the impact of the experience remained with me throughout the rest of my journey to Atlanta and during the long drive home to Detroit with a return load of textile products. I completed that run safely, as I had hundreds of others, but the warnings and advice from the memorial voices stayed with me during the following weeks as I considered the major decision points in my life. The predicted accident never occurred, perhaps because I was more cautious during the Chicago to Miami run they had mentioned, perhaps because advance warning had allowed me to avoid the dangerous situation entirely, or perhaps because the future they had seen was just one of many possible outcomes. 3 months later, I accepted my sister's job offer and transitioned from long-haul trucking to office work in Cincinnati. The decision wasn't based entirely on the supernatural encounter in the Kentucky mountains, but the voices from the roadside memorials had provided a perspective on my choices that I couldn't have gained through conventional means. They had reminded me that every profession involves risks, and that the question isn't whether to face dangers, but how to make informed decisions about which risks are worth taking. I still drive past roadside memorials occasionally during weekend trips and family visits, but I've never again heard the whispers that guided me through that foggy night in the Cumberland Mountains. Perhaps the sensitivity that allowed me to hear their voices was connected to my life as a professional driver, or perhaps they only speak to travelers who are facing crucial decisions about their futures. I'll never know for certain, but I'm grateful for their guidance during a time when I needed wisdom from sources beyond my own limited experience. The highway holds many secrets, and some of the most valuable lessons come from those who have completed their final journeys and remain behind to help other travelers navigate the same dangerous routes. The voices from roadside memorials may not speak to everyone, but for those who can hear them, they offer a perspective on life and death, risk and safety that can only come from souls who have crossed the ultimate threshold and chosen to share their hard-earned knowledge with the living. The Crimson Fuel, from Robert Hayes. The fuel flowing from pump number 3 at Murphy's Station had a distinctly red tint that I initially attributed to the flickering neon sign casting colored light across the concrete island on this rain-soaked November night in rural Alabama. My Western Star 5700XE had been running low on diesel for the past 50 miles, and this isolated truck stop along Highway 21 was the only option for fuel between Montgomery and the Mississippi border. Despite its run-down appearance and the unnerving silence that seemed to emanate from the empty parking lot like fog rising from warm pavement. I'd been hauling lumber from Pensacola to Memphis, a straightforward run that should have been completed without incident, but a series of unexpected delays had pushed my driving time to the legal limit and left me searching for fuel in an area where truck stops were few and far between. Murphy's Station appeared on my GPS as the nearest diesel supplier, though the satellite imagery showed a facility that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s, with outdated pump designs and a convenience store that seemed too small to support much commercial traffic. The place was eerily quiet when I pulled up to the diesel island, with no other vehicles visible anywhere on the property and no signs of activity from the convenience store despite the lights being on and the open 24 hours sign glowing in red letters above the front door. The pumps themselves were ancient, mechanical units with analog displays that showed fuel prices at least $1 below current market rates, though I assume the numbers simply hadn't been updated in recent memory. I inserted my credit card into the payment slot and waited for authorization, listening to the steady drum of rain on my cab roof and the distant hum of electrical transformers that seemed unusually loud in the surrounding quiet. When the pump finally activated with a mechanical click that echoed across the empty lot, I lifted the nozzle and noticed that the fuel hose felt warm to the touch, much warmer than it should have been given the cool November air, and the fact that no recent pumping activity could have heated the system. The diesel began flowing immediately when I squeezed the nozzle handle, but instead of the familiar golden amber color I expected, the liquid streaming into my tank was distinctly red, with a viscosity that seemed thicker than normal fuel and a metallic scent that reminded me of old pennies left in water. I released the handle and stepped back, assuming there was some kind of contamination in the fuel lines. But the pump continued running on its own, the mechanical counter spinning steadily as the red liquid continued flowing into my truck. My first thought was to stop the fueling process and find another station, but the nearest alternative was over 100 miles away, and my fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank remaining. I tried to convince myself that the red coloration was simply due to additives or dyes used to differentiate diesel fuel from other petroleum products, though I had never encountered anything quite like this in 15 years of professional driving. As the pump continued its automatic operation, I walked toward the convenience store to speak with the attendant about the unusual fuel characteristics, but the building appeared empty, despite the lights and the unlocked front door. Inside, the shelves were stocked with typical truck stop merchandise, but everything looked slightly off, as if the products were arranged by someone who had never actually worked in retail, but was trying to recreate the appearance of a functioning store based on distant memories or second-hand descriptions. The coffee pot behind the counter contained a dark liquid that looked more like blood than coffee, and the hot dogs on the warming rollers had an unnatural red coloration that matched the fuel flowing from the pump outside. Most disturbing was the cash register, which displayed a transaction in progress showing my credit card information and a fuel sale amount that was climbing steadily despite the fact that no one was operating the system. "Evening, driver," came a voice from behind me, though I hadn't heard anyone enter the store. I turned to see a man in his 60s wearing a stained coverall with Murphy's Station embroidered above the breast pocket, but his appearance was somehow wrong, as if he were a photograph that had been slightly out of focus when it was taken. "Your fuel has an unusual color," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is there something wrong with your diesel supply?" "Oh, that," he replied with a smile that revealed teeth stained the same red color as the fuel. "We get a special blend here, direct from our suppliers, much more nutritious than regular diesel. Gives engines a kind of vitality that standard petroleum products can't provide." "Nutritious fuel?" I repeated, the absurdity of the statement making me question whether I was having some kind of stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. "You'd be surprised how similar the human circulatory system is to a truck's fuel system," he continued, moving behind the counter with movements that seemed too fluid, too smooth for normal human locomotion. "Both transport life-giving liquid through networks of tubes and channels. Both require regular maintenance and occasional refills. The main difference is in the quality of the fluid being circulated." As he spoke, I became aware of sounds coming from deeper within the building. Mechanical noises that reminded me of pumps and compressors, but with an organic quality that suggested they were processing something more complex than petroleum products. The smell in the air was growing stronger, that metallic scent I had noticed at the fuel pump, but now concentrated and almost overwhelming in the confined space of the store. "I think I'll find fuel somewhere else," I said, backing toward the door, but the attendant's expression shifted from friendly to concerned. "Oh, but you can't leave now," he said, his voice taking on an urgency that made my skin crawl. "The fueling process has already begun, and interrupting it at this stage would be very dangerous for both you and your truck. The new fuel needs time to integrate with your existing diesel supply to adapt to your engine's specific requirements." Through the store windows, I could see that my truck was still connected to the pump, the red liquid continuing to flow into my fuel tank, despite the fact that it should have been full by now based on the mechanical counter display. More troubling was the fact that my truck seemed to be glowing slightly, as if the red fuel were causing some kind of luminescence in the metal components of the fuel system. "What exactly is that stuff you're putting in my tank?" I demanded. But the attendant's smile widened to reveal more of those stained teeth, and I noticed that his gums were the same dark red color. "Life essence," he replied simply. "The concentrated vitality of previous customers who decided to stay and become part of our operation here. Much more efficient than regular diesel, burns cleaner, provides better performance, and creates a connection between the vehicle and its operator that goes far beyond normal mechanical relationships." I ran for the door, abandoning any attempt to appear calm or rational, but as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't turn. The exit that had been unlocked when I entered was now sealed, trapping me inside with the increasingly unstable attendant and whatever mechanical processes were operating in the back rooms of the building. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," he said, walking toward me with those unnaturally smooth movements. "Most drivers find the transition quite pleasant once they stop fighting it. The fuel will enhance your truck's performance dramatically, and in exchange, you'll contribute to our ability to serve other travelers who stop here for fuel." Through the window, I could see that other vehicles were now arriving at the station. Trucks that I hadn't heard approaching, despite the quiet night air that should have carried the sound of diesel engines for miles. They moved silently toward the fuel pumps, their drivers climbing down from their cabs with the same fluid movements I had noticed in the attendant, all of them wearing expressions of calm satisfaction that suggested they had found something at this place that they hadn't been looking for but were grateful to have discovered. The mechanical noises from the back rooms were getting louder, and I could now identify them as pumping systems. But instead of moving petroleum products, they seemed to be circulating something with a much higher viscosity, something that gurgled and flowed with the unmistakable sound of liquid that contained organic matter. "The process will be complete soon," the attendant said, checking a watch that appeared to be running backward, its hands moving counterclockwise through positions that didn't correspond to normal time measurements. "Your truck is almost fully integrated with our fuel supply, and once that's finished, you'll understand why so many drivers choose to make this their permanent stop." I looked around the store desperately, searching for another exit or some kind of weapon I could use to defend myself, but the merchandise on the shelves was changing as I watched, transforming from normal truck stop products into items that looked more like medical supplies or laboratory equipment. The coffee pot now contained a liquid that was obviously blood, and the warming trays held objects that looked disturbingly like organs preserved in some kind of red solution. That's when I noticed that the rain outside had stopped, and the parking lot was now filled with dozens of trucks, all connected to fuel pumps that were dispensing the same red liquid I had seen flowing into my own tank. The drivers stood beside their vehicles with expressions of peaceful contentment, but their skin had taken on a pale, translucent quality that made them look more like wax figures than living people. The door behind the counter opened, and more attendants emerged, all wearing the same stained coveralls, all moving with that same unsettling fluidity. They carried equipment that looked like medical instruments crossed with automotive tools, devices designed for purposes I didn't want to understand, but which were obviously intended for use on me. "Don't worry," the original attendant said, his voice now taking on a soothing, hypnotic quality. "The fuel will make your truck run better than it ever has before. More power, better fuel economy, enhanced performance in all weather conditions. And in exchange, you'll help us maintain our operation here, serving other travelers who need what we have to offer." I closed my eyes and tried to think, to find some way out of this impossible situation, but my thoughts were becoming sluggish, as if the red fuel weren't just affecting my truck, but was somehow influencing my mental processes as well. Through the store windows, I could see my Western Star, and it was indeed glowing more brightly now, its chrome and paint reflecting the red light from the fuel pumps in ways that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. The attendants were moving closer, their instruments ready, their expressions patient but determined. But just as they reached for me, I heard the distant sound of another truck approaching, its engine running rough and loud in a way that suggested mechanical problems. The attendants paused, turning toward the windows with expressions of anticipation. And in that moment of distraction, I lunged for the cash register. The machine was still displaying my fuel transaction, showing an amount that was climbing far beyond what my tank capacity should have allowed. I grabbed the power cord and yanked it from the wall, and immediately the pumps outside stopped running, the red glow fading from my truck, and the door handle turned freely in my hand. I ran across the parking lot, dodging between the silent trucks and their zombie-like drivers, reaching my Western Star just as the fuel pump automatically shut off and released the nozzle. My fuel gauge showed a full tank, but the diesel in the transparent fuel filter looked normal, golden amber without any trace of the red liquid I had seen flowing from the pump. I started my engine and pulled away from Murphy Station as quickly as I could safely manage, watching in my mirrors as the building and the other trucks faded into the darkness. Within minutes, the entire scene had disappeared as if it had never existed, leaving me alone on Highway 21 with a full tank of fuel and a story that I knew no one would ever believe. The truck ran normally for the rest of my journey to Memphis with no signs of contamination or unusual performance characteristics from whatever had actually been pumped into my tank. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through isolated areas where truck stops are few and far between, I catch a whiff of that metallic scent in my cab, and I wonder if some trace of Murphy Station is still with me, still flowing through my fuel system, still connecting me to that place where the boundary between mechanical and organic, between fuel and life essence, had become dangerously blurred. The highway holds many secrets, and some truck stops serve more than just food and fuel to the travelers who find them in their moments of greatest need. I've learned to be more careful about where I stop for fuel, to pay attention to prices that seem too good to be true, and to trust my instincts when something about a place feels wrong, even if I can't immediately identify what's triggering my unease. The Eight-Legged Shadow. From Dale Morrison. The massive spider first appeared in my mirror somewhere between Bakersfield and Barstow, a dark silhouette moving through the California desert at impossible speeds, keeping pace with my Peterbilt 399 as I hauled a load of agricultural equipment through the Mojave on a star-filled Wednesday night in late September. At first glance, I mistook it for another truck running without headlights, perhaps an oversized load being transported during off-peak hours to avoid daytime traffic restrictions. But as the miles passed and the shape remained visible in my side mirrors, I began to realize that what I was seeing defied conventional explanation. The creature moved with a fluid, organic grace that no mechanical vehicle could replicate, its body low to the ground but covering distance with each stride that suggested legs spanning far wider than any normal truck and trailer combination. In the dim glow of my taillights, I could make out the general outline of something that resembled a spider, but scaled up to automotive proportions, its dark carapace reflecting starlight like polished obsidian as it maintained a steady following distance of roughly a quarter mile behind my rig. I'd been driving professionally for 12 years, hauling everything from fresh produce to heavy machinery across the western states, and I'd encountered my share of unusual wildlife along remote highways. Desert regions were particularly known for surprising encounters with animals that most people never saw, creatures that emerged from hidden places during the cooler hours of darkness to hunt or migrate according to ancient patterns that predated human civilization by millions of years. But this was something beyond my experience, something that challenged basic assumptions about the natural world and the limits of biological possibility. The CB radio had been quiet for most of the night, typical for this stretch of Highway 58 that connected the Central Valley to the high desert. But now I keyed the microphone and tried to raise other drivers who might be traveling the same route. Breaker 19, this is eastbound Peterbilt, approaching Mojave. Looking for any drivers who might have eyes on some unusual wildlife in the area. Static answered for several seconds before a gravelly voice responded with the kind of weary tone that comes from decades of night driving through lonely places. "Eastbound Pete, this westbound Kenworth about 15 miles ahead of your position. What kind of unusual wildlife are you talking about?" I hesitated, knowing how the truth would sound to another professional driver. Hard to describe exactly, but it appears to be following my truck at a consistent distance. Large, moving on multiple legs, keeping pace at highway speed. "Son," came the response after a pause, "I've been running this route for 23 years, and I've seen coyotes, mountain lions, wild horses, and even the occasional escaped ostrich from those farms near Victorville. But I ain't never seen nothing that could keep up with a truck at highway speed on that many legs. You might want to pull over and check your mirrors. Make sure you ain't seeing reflections or shadows playing tricks on you." But even as we talked, the Spider continued its steady pursuit, never gaining ground but never falling behind, its movement so synchronized with my truck's speed that it seemed almost as if we were connected by some invisible tether. When I accelerated slightly to test its response, the creature increased its pace accordingly, maintaining that precise quarter-mile gap with the kind of consistency that suggested intelligence and purpose, rather than coincidental parallel travel. The highway stretched ahead through landscape that looked more like an alien planet than anything terrestrial, with Joshua trees casting strange shadows in the starlight, and rocky outcroppings that resembled ancient ruins left by civilizations that had vanished before humans learned to make fire. This was country where the normal rules seemed suspended, where the boundaries between possible and impossible became blurred by distance and darkness, and the sheer vastness of empty space that separated one town from the next. As I crested a long grade that provided a panoramic view of the desert floor ahead, I could see the lights of Mojave twinkling in the distance like a small constellation that had fallen to Earth. But when I checked my mirrors, the Spider had closed the distance between us, now following at perhaps 100 yards, close enough that I could make out individual details of its anatomy in the red glow of my marker lights. It was indeed a spider, but one that had grown to proportions that shouldn't have been biologically possible. Each leg was easily 20 feet long, moving with articulated precision across the desert floor, and its body was roughly the size of a passenger car, covered in what appeared to be a natural armor of overlapping plates that gleamed like black metal in the darkness. Most unsettling were its eyes, multiple clusters of reflective orbs that caught and held light, with a kind of intelligence that suggested this was no ordinary creature driven by simple instinct or hunger. My speedometer showed 55 miles per hour, appropriate for the winding descent toward the desert floor, but the Spider was maintaining pace effortlessly, its legs moving in a rhythm that looked almost mechanical in its precision. As I watched in fascination and growing unease, it began to move closer, reducing the gap between us to less than 50 yards, close enough that I could hear sounds carried on the desert wind that might have been breathing, or perhaps the whisper of its legs against the asphalt. The town of Mojave appeared ahead like an oasis of civilization in the vast emptiness, its truck stops and motels offering the possibility of sanctuary from whatever was pursuing me through the night. But as I signaled for the off-ramp that would take me to fuel and food and the company of other human beings, the Spider did something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel and my heart rate accelerate beyond anything that caffeine or adrenaline alone could explain. It reared up on its hind legs, raising the front portion of its body until it towered above my trailer, and in that position I could see that it was even larger than I had estimated. Standing upright, it was easily 15 feet tall, with mandibles that gleamed in the artificial light from the truck stop ahead, and those multiple eyes focused on my cab with an intensity that left no doubt that I was the specific object of its attention. But instead of attacking or trying to stop my truck, it simply settled back down and continued following as I took the exit ramp, maintaining that same precise distance as we descended toward the bright lights of the Mojave truck stop complex. Other drivers were fueling their rigs and moving between the restaurant and the convenience store, going about their normal routines with no indication that they were aware of the massive predator that had followed me out of the desert. I parked at the far end of the lot, away from the main building and the other trucks, and sat in my cab watching the mirrors to see what the spider would do now that we had reached what appeared to be our destination. It positioned itself at the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the overhead lighting, and settled into what looked like a waiting posture, its body low to the ground, but its eyes remaining fixed on my location. Through my CB radio, I could hear the normal chatter of drivers sharing information about traffic conditions, fuel prices, and weather forecasts. But when I tried to break in with reports about the creature in the parking lot, my transmission seemed to be ignored or misunderstood by other operators. Either they couldn't hear me clearly, or the information I was trying to convey was so far outside normal experience that their minds simply refused to process it. I climbed down from my cab, thinking that the spider might retreat when confronted by a human on foot, but it remained in position, watching me with those multiple eyes that reflected the truck stop lighting like dark mirrors. Up close, I could see that its exoskeleton was not entirely natural looking, but had markings and patterns that seemed almost artificial, as if it were some kind of hybrid creation that combined organic and mechanical elements. Other drivers passed within yards of where the spider crouched, but none of them showed any reaction to its presence, walking past as if it were invisible, or perhaps simply part of the normal desert landscape that surrounded the truck stop. I tried calling attention to it, pointing in its direction and asking other truckers if they could see what I was seeing, but their responses indicated that either they couldn't perceive the creature at all, or they were choosing to ignore it for reasons I couldn't understand. "You okay, driver?" asked a woman filling her truck at the adjacent fuel island. "You seem pretty agitated about something." "There's a spider the size of a car sitting right over there," I said, pointing toward the creature that was clearly visible in the parking lot lighting. She followed my gesture, looking directly at the spot where the spider waited, but her expression showed no recognition or alarm. "I don't see anything unusual," she said. "Maybe you should grab some coffee and take a break. Long hauls through the desert can play tricks on your eyes sometimes." I walked toward the convenience store, glancing back frequently to keep the spider in sight, but it made no move to follow or threaten me. Instead, it seemed content to wait in its chosen position, as patient and motionless as a natural rock formation, except for those eyes that tracked my movement with unwavering attention. Inside the store, I approached the night clerk, a young man who had probably seen his share of tired drivers experiencing various forms of road-induced stress and disorientation. "There's something in your parking lot," I told him. "Something large and potentially dangerous that other people don't seem to be able to see." He looked through the windows toward the area I indicated, his expression patient but skeptical. "Sir, I've got security cameras covering every inch of that lot, and I can tell you there's nothing out there except trucks and cars. Maybe you should consider getting a room for the night, get some rest before continuing your trip." But when I looked at the security monitors behind his counter, the screens showed normal parking lot activity with no sign of the massive spider that I could clearly see through the windows. Either the cameras couldn't detect whatever I was looking at, or my perception of reality had become so distorted that I was experiencing hallucinations that seemed completely real to my senses. I purchased coffee and a sandwich, trying to maintain some semblance of normal behavior while processing the implications of what I was experiencing. If other people couldn't see the spider, then either it existed in some form that was invisible to normal perception, or I was suffering from a breakdown that made me believe in the reality of something that was purely imaginary. But when I returned to my truck, the creature was still there, still watching, still waiting, with that same patient attention. As I climbed back into my cab and prepared to continue my journey toward Barstow and eventually Phoenix, the spider rose from its resting position and moved to resume its following formation, maintaining that precise quarter-mile distance as I pulled back onto Highway 58. The rest of my trip proceeded without incident, but the spider remained visible in my mirrors throughout the night, never approaching closer than its established following distance, but never falling behind or abandoning its pursuit. When I finally reached my delivery destination in Phoenix and backed up to the loading dock to unload my cargo of agricultural equipment, The creature positioned itself in the industrial area where it could observe the proceedings while remaining hidden from the dock workers and company supervisors. I completed the delivery and picked up a return load bound for Sacramento, but as I prepared to leave Phoenix, I realized that the spider was no longer following me. Whatever purpose had brought it into my life during that desert crossing seemed to have been fulfilled, and it had disappeared as mysteriously as it had originally appeared in my mirrors near Bakersfield. But sometimes, during night runs through remote areas where the highway stretches endlessly between distant cities, I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision that might be shadows or reflections, or might be something else entirely. The desert holds many secrets, and some creatures that inhabit the spaces between civilization operate according to rules and purposes that we're not equipped to understand. The eight-legged shadow may be gone from my mirrors, but I've learned to pay closer attention to the wildlife that shares the highways with commercial traffic, and I've developed a deeper respect for the possibility that our world contains things that exist just beyond the normal range of human perception, waiting patiently for the right conditions to reveal themselves to travelers who venture far enough from the familiar paths to encounter the truly extraordinary.